hello, and welcome to this week's episode of The Giant Pod with me, your host, Andy Wrintmore, and my lord, we have a big bumper jumbo giant edition of The Giant Pod for you today. You might notice the runtime on it is slightly longer than what you're used to here. We are going down a rabbit hole with our guest this week. His name is Cole Henley. He is telling us the story of his great-grandfather, Albert Schreiner, who is a prolific East German political figure who's been largely unreported or underreported throughout history. He pops up throughout the early 20th century during World War I, a Spanish Civil War. I believe there's possibly some World War II. Well, there's definitely some World War II stuff. There's a meeting with Lenin at some point. Oh, it's unbelievable. The story is unreal. This is the only place where Albert Schreiner's entire history is collected right now, right here on this podcast. It could be a Netflix documentary. It could be a HBO special. It's just absolutely insane. It's very dense politically. It's very dense socially. It's very dense historically. It really is a super deep dive. Big props to Cole for being so erudite with his knowledge, and so well researched before coming onto this pod. And thank you, Cole, again for the homebrew. Harry had to cut quite a bit of me out towards the end of the pod because I was sort of slurring my questions, apparently. So here it is. This is a big deep dive. This is a big giant pod for you. Cole Henley telling the story of Albert Schreiner. This is so epic. I really hope you enjoy it. Here it is. Saying, can we buy some to take away? And the landlady just like filled up like an old lemonade 2-litre bottle, and we paid her like $3.50 for it. So, I mean, it's that old school.
Like it's all a petrol canister,
right? It's all like that, yeah. And it was like, thanks for coming. Do you know what I mean? Like, and we were on
the other side.
We were on our way with this bottle, just sharing it. And I woke up underneath a swing in Norton St Philip. There's a blackout between the.
That's the story.
With her sister with a torch. We were both on the floor, passed out, with a torch in our face. Like, found you. Like,
told you.
So I wonder if this is a half it.
Yeah, no, it's not going to be that strong.
That's nice.
Oh, you're getting hints of.
I'm getting that IPA feel.
Hoppy.
Hoppy.
I can't remember what's hops in it.
So we should probably get on to, that is very nice actually, we should probably get on to why you've been invited on this podcast. You have a great-grandfather who's a bit of a legendary figure in German/Russian left-wing politics, I would say.
Yeah, what I find interesting is he's not widely talked about.
Right.
But he does appear in all the right places at the right time, or the wrong places, or the right or the wrong. You know?
Right. So where he's popping up in the history books, you find...
Well, if you look at big events in German history from, say, 1918 through to like the Second World War, he's there thereabouts with some of the major figures in left-wing politics, but never is really mentioned. So I don't know. I don't know if he's really canny and knows to sort of keep his head down, or whether he's been written out of history, because the communist movement... because he was a communist.
Yeah.
So the communist movement in both Germany and Russia, and not just talking about this period, I'm talking about right through until 1989, 1990, were very controlling about the histories they wrote and the stories they told and who was mentioned and who was omitted from history. So
right.
I don't know if that's a part of it. But yeah, he's a very interesting character that I knew of growing up. I was aware about him. A bit of context, my grandmother was German.
Yeah.
She came to England in 1935 as a refugee because they'd left Germany when the Nazis got into power in 1933. So they went to Paris, and I think basically as a child she got free education until a certain age, and she was 15. And then they said that basically her free education stopped. They knew they couldn't afford to educate her, so they managed to arrange through the Red Cross for her to come to England as a refugee, and then she stayed here for the rest of her life.
That's amazing. So you've been tracing your great-grandfather, haven't you? But before we go right down that big rabbit hole, we should probably get a little bit of backstory on you and what you do and how and your life leading up to this point, I guess, because I think that you're probably using skills that you've learned along the way, haven't you, to build this story? Partly,
yeah. So I've always been into history, and I've always been kind of the family genealogist.
Right.
I went to university to study archaeology and became an archaeologist for a number of, not that many years. I studied a PhD in Cardiff. And then after completing that, struggling to get work, or at least well-paid work with a young family, moved into what I do now, which is web development, making websites. But I suppose I've always been fascinated by history and the past.
Yeah.
And I think that's always been something that family members have tapped me up on to help out with. I mean, and the genesis of this project has been my uncle dying in 2017, I think it was. So my uncle, I was very close to, lived in London. He was very close to my great-grandfather growing up. And I went to visit him. He'd been ill. He had cancer. Right. And I'd been meaning to see him for a long time and never quite got round to seeing him. But at the time, I was teaching at the University of Greenwich. So I was teaching web design there. So I was like, right, I'm coming into London. Can I come and stay with you the night before? Before I go teaching, we can catch up, chew the fat, see how you are. Because I know he'd been very unwell.
Right.
And that evening, it turned out some friends of the family were there. We got chatting. One of the friends of the family was German, and he started talking about, we need to go to Germany to do this project. And what transpired was that when my great-grandfather was on his deathbed in Berlin, in 1979, he was flown over, my uncle was flown over to see him on his deathbed. And he was basically asked to write his history because he lived in the communist East Germany. He was worried that his story wouldn't be told.
Right.
Or that if it was told, it would be politicized.
I see, yeah.
So this was in 1979, the too long don't read. In 1979, my uncle was charged with writing the biography of my great-grandfather. If we jump forward to 2017, he never got round to it.
And that's a long time to put that off, isn't it?
Well, I think it was on the back burner. I think my uncle was a big character, led a very busy life.
Right.
And also, partly, he idolised him. And I think he was worried about potentially finding out something he wouldn't
skeletons in the closet. And
exactly.
When they say never meet your heroes, don't they? And I guess to a degree, that would be that'd be really...
Yeah, and I think, he definitely had him on a pedestal. Like, it's a bit of a tangent, but I've got two boys.
Yeah.
Boys are hard work,
Yeah.
And I read a book about raising boys called Raising Boys, and funnily enough. But the one thing, there's lots of psychobabble, but one thing that stuck in my mind from that book was that when a child or when a boy is a toddler, a baby and a toddler, their mum is their world. They look up to their mother. That is their frame of reference. That's the sort of, the star that guides them, that they look up to and follow.
Right.
When they get to, I suppose, sort of post-toddler, when they get to school age, they look to their father. They start to look for, shaping themselves and realising that, they're not just a person, that they are a gender or a sex or whatever. And this is quite generalised, but, it's sort of, for a lot of people, it rings quite true, and it definitely stuck with me. So yeah, once they reach a certain age, they start looking to their father for guidance and start mimicking their father and things. And then what happens when they become a teenager? They start to feel that they need to be independent of their family group. So they seek an outside male figure for guidance. And that really stuck with me. One, because for me, that was my grandfather.
Right.
So my uncle's father. But I also recognised that for my uncle, it was his grandfather, my great-grandfather.
Right.
So I saw a lot of connections there. And to go back to your point, I think because a lot of what the archives were, a lot of the German archives are, they're Stasi archives.
Right.
So they're
which is, just assume that I don't know.
Oh, no, sorry. Yeah. So the Stasi were the East German secret police.
Right.
So East Germany was a communist state from 1950-something, I can't remember what, to 1989.
Right.
Very controlled society, a sort of an arm of Russia in the West. I heard someone describe it as not as militant as Russia,
right?
But very controlled. And, so I don't know if you've seen films like The Lives of Others and Goodbye Lenin, where, on the one hand, it was a very socialist country. There was no unemployment. No one went hungry. But the flip side of that is that the state provided shit food. There were queues around the blocks whenever a shipment of bananas came in or whatever.
Yeah.
My great uncle, I suppose, he was a state paid potter.
Right.
So he was an artist and he got paid by the state to be an artist. So, from one sense, that's a really idealistic thing. But on the other hand, it was a very cloak and dagger society. They had the media and everything controlled the way people lived. The Stasi were the sort of the front troops of that and controlling how everyone lived and observing people that were seen as corrupted or mal-influenced or what have you.
Yeah.
And they kept files on everyone. That's why I mentioned them, because they had files on every single citizen in the country and citizens outside the country, because a lot of my family were going over to East Germany a lot. I went there in 86 before the wall came down. And as a kid, that's really exciting. It's a new country. It's very different. But you only have to sort of peel back a few layers and realise things weren't quite right.
Right.
And not quite. We were followed everywhere by a friend of the family.
It's a lot of effort, isn't it?
Yeah.
For the state to go to.
I think so. And I think it was definitely, I think East Germany was a very identityless place because it was half German and half Russian.
Yeah.
And it was very much in the dependency of Russia for its economy and its ideas. And so it was kind of, running on fumes for a long time. And that's usually when and we'll come on to that in the history, when there is economic and social struggle, that's when the sort of the baddies get a foothold, the bad ideas start to swell. My area of interest is primarily his life in the time leading up to and immediately following World War II.
Yeah.
There is a book there I can show you, which is great for podcasts. Someone has written a biography of him, but it mostly focused on his life when he returned to East Germany. He was a quite famous historian in East Germany.
So your uncle pedestaled him, and he lived in East Germany, right? Oh no, you were
in London.
He lived in London.
Yeah. So my uncle lived in London for years. He was in theatre. He was this crazy guy that ran around Europe with theatre and just was. He was diagnosed as a teenager with chronic rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
So he spent his whole life in crippling pain, which he solved through alcohol.
Right.
And he would have a glass of wine for breakfast, and he was a character, and he had good days and bad days, like all people, but particularly people that have a slight alcohol dependency. But I loved him, and he was just a big character. But anyway, I went to see him in London because I was teaching the next day and he wanted to catch up. And we sat there talking about this sort of pipe dream of arranging for everyone to go over to Berlin. I would help him with the archives, even though I don't speak. He would provide the German, I would provide the history. We could work together on this project. And he gave me, I meant to bring it. He gave me a lantern, a paper lantern that his grandfather had given him when he was a child. So, passing the baton on sort of thing. And that night, he was rushed into hospital and died the next day.
Wow.
I went with him in the ambulance, stayed with him overnight, and stayed with him until he died. He passed away. I don't think he quite accepted how ill he was.
Right.
But it was very nice, not nice, but, it was lovely to be able to spend his final day with him.
Yeah.
But we talked a lot in the time that he had the energy, and a lot of it was built around this guilt he had about having never written this biography.
Right.
So baton passed.
Okay. And so then you end up in hospital with him, and as you said, he passes away. So then what? You sat. So I guess you sat in his place, right?
Yeah. So I sat on it for a while,
and you go, right, what do I do? Was that the most prevalent thought in your head at that time? Or?
Yeah, it burned. It burned there, and it was burning away for a while, and then I went away. So this was December. So the following Easter, I went to visit an old friend who lived in Scotland, and we met halfway. It wasn't quite halfway, but went up to the Lake District. We booked a place together. took our dogs, just went for dog walks and things like that. And it was ticking it. It was like that space to think made things crystallize. And I thought, right, I need to do this. I want to do this. I don't know how on earth I'm going to be able to arrange it, but maybe if I did it, I had 2 ideas came to me that weekend. One was that if I'm going to do it, I'm going to write a comic. I think because I was really into reading and comics, and I was drawing a lot. I've always drawn a lot, right. Not professionally, just as a creative outlet.
Yeah.
And I thought, I could just immediately see the visual potential of producing something that was telling your story in visual form. And there's a number of comics I've been reading which were sort of biographical comics.
Yeah.
And that immediately stuck with me.
What ones were you reading? And these is there like a particular
there's definitely
author who does them?
Not so much authors, but publishers. So
right.
Self-Made Hero is one, Myriad Press is another. I'm trying to think. But they generally tend to do historical and biographical graphic novels about famous individuals. Right. But these individuals are like Che Guevara and stuff.
Yeah. So they're not very specialist.
No. And I think sort of, but I was definitely, so I was convinced that I wanted to tell a story, and I didn't want it to be a history book. I think sort of, if I started going down that path, I knew I'd fall back on what I did in archaeology, which is quite academic.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be accessible. I think, his story is not just his personal story, but his story is situated in a story that very few people know about.
Right.
If you go to Waterstones and you go and look in the section on German history, it will be 95 books on the Nazis, 2 books on the medieval period, 1 book on either side of those periods, and maybe a couple on what happened with the dissolution and reunification of Germany.
Right.
There is nothing on the period of the 20th century that the Nazis were in power about the other voices.
Right.
The communists, the socialists. And I really felt that was something that needed to be addressed. In my crazy idea, I thought a comic would be the most accessible way of producing that.
Yeah.
And keeping me away from writing a very academic text.
Okay. And are you capable of writing an academic text? Would that be something that you wouldn't see as a huge challenge? Because for me, stuff like that is like, I'd much rather sit there and dictate it and take twice as long, I think, than to sit and type and do. For me, I find that very intimidating. Not that I can't do it, I just know that I suck at it. I suck at getting it done.
I like writing, and when I did the PhD, that was 120,000 words.
Right.
Admittedly over sort of 4 years or so.
Yeah.
But I always enjoyed writing. I find I've always found, and it's not just archaeology, when I do web stuff and I've written about that, I like to think I've got quite a nice balance between sort of technical and accessible.
Yeah.
So I'm not massively afraid of writing a big text, and I actually quite enjoy the act of writing. I find, it does require a massive amount of focus.
Yeah.
Which is very difficult. If to write, I generally would have to go and take myself away somewhere.
Right.
But generally, the act of writing itself, I find quite cathartic.
Yeah.
Getting ideas down, sort of getting a structure down, and then breaking that up, and then flowing through a narrative. Yeah. To sort of get that, join the dots in that piece.
I enjoy writing about things that I'm passionate about. And sometimes I'll make social media posts that may possibly have a little bit more sort of ambition to them in the sort of text department. But yeah, it's that getting started thing. I think is is looking at the bottom of the mountain. I think once you get into it and you're in that sort of pocket and it's flowing, I do enjoy it then. But yeah, I mean, everyone's different.
I think a big part of the problem is schools kill excitement about writing.
Yeah.
The act of writing is in most schools an act of torture, and it's very usually irrelevant. I think sort of everyone can write, and I suppose the 2 challenges with writing is, one, the mountain, like you say.
Yeah.
How am I going to tackle this beast?
Yeah.
And the only solution is planning and research. Yeah. And breaking it up into smaller chunks, and that's and it's not just writing. You can say that about anything. But also the other thing is not worrying about the end product, because and I'm guilty of this, I'm a perfectionist, but I'm learning slowly the hard way that if you obsess about and focus on getting it right in the end, you'll find 101 reasons either not to start, which is probably where my uncle fell through.
Right, yeah.
Or getting a certain way down and then going back and thinking, oh, it's not quite right.
Here's a question for you. If your uncle had done it, would it have done him the justice that yours will do, given that he was in so much pain and had so many issues?
I think he would have done it very differently. And I'm not just talking about the medium. I think he would have told a very different story. Like I said, he was a theatre producer, so I think he would have done something very dramatic and theatrical.
It sounds like a very cinematic. What am I trying to say here? When I read the website earlier, Finding Albert, where you essentially sort of pitch what you're going to do and why you're doing it, I read it earlier and I was like, this sounds like a fucking great TV show. Or documentary. It sounds like something for the screen. It sounds like something, and he sounds like a character that could be very easily explored and put into a longer form sort of television format, let's say. So yeah, I guess you're right. He probably would have done it from the angle of a very theatrical.
I think if he'd done it, it would have been very theatrical and very political.
Right.
And we'll come on to his life in a bit more detail, but you cannot divorce his life from politics.
Right.
But there's political as in a participant in politics, and there's political as in a message that a narrative is trying to deliver. And I think for my uncle, it would have been the latter. It comes back to what I was saying to you before outside, is that I've tried to be objective about this. He's my great-grandfather, and, I love him, or even though I met him, I love him because he's family, and I love him because of what he stood for, and I love him because he brought up my gran, who I adored, and instilled most of my values either directly or through my mother. And that's been a very big challenge, trying to divorce that love from peeling apart the layers of history, exposing some things that are good, some things are bad.
Yeah.
And I think with my uncle, he would have partly been paralysed by that.
Yeah.
And partly would have, because he idolised him rather than just loving him, I think there would have been a political narrative that would have been very much focused on him being a hero.
Right.
And one thing that's been incredibly challenging throughout this process is trying to keep a step back and have that love for him and that desire to tell his story.
Yeah.
Without idolising him.
Right.
I'll leave that to the audience, if they...
Yeah. That makes sense. And so you're in the Lake District. I guess this is where the moment is where you finally go, right, I have to do this.
Probably the pub.
Yeah. You're in the Lake District and you're with your friend.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you bounce this idea off your friend.
I'm not even sure I do. I think it's it's a thing that's just germinating.
Right.
There's a long drive up there. There's a period of time where we're just going for walks and hanging out, playing chess and stuff like that, and then driving back. And I think there's just this slow period of reflection which I hadn't had time for.
Yeah.
And I think it was probably on the drive home, it was just whirring around in my head. I had a lot more clarity about how I might tackle it. And the first thing that popped into my head, apart from the comic book idea, the second thing, was the only way I could do it is to raise money. Because it's not just about sitting there with pens and paper. Yeah. It's about research. So I knew I needed to go to Germany to go and find out more. So I started a Kickstarter on the back of that. I sort of just had this brainwave, just this idea that I randomly buy crap on Kickstarter all the time and fully know that it's something that may never happen. You're investing in an idea. You're not investing in a product.
Right.
And I thought that way of getting lots of people to chip in a small amount would help me be able to take some time out from work, pay for my flights and accommodation, go to Stuttgart, where he grew up, and then Berlin, where the archives are. Okay.
And so you make this Kickstarter, and with things like Kickstarter comes a certain amount of PR, let's say. There has to be... You have to sell this, you have to pry the money out of people's wallets, don't you, somehow? So how do you pitch it to people you may not know necessarily?
I think I was quite naive. I just primarily hoped that I could tap into my existing networks. And like I said before this, that, you know, sort of, I make websites for a living.
Yeah.
And the web development community is where all social media started.
Yeah.
So there's a very strong base of people I don't have a strong base of people, but there's a strong base of people that are interested in what you do outside of making websites.
Right.
And so I just naively thought, if I could tap into that, if I could get 100 people to tap in 10 quid.
Yeah. It's very manageable.
That's a flight to Berlin.
Yeah.
And some accommodation for a couple of days.
And so how does your Kickstarter go? Did it go better than you thought?
It went better than I thought, yeah. And I didn't have to do... I mean, it could have done better, I think, if I had really pushed it.
Yeah.
I was very transparent about I didn't really know what I was doing. But and one of the things when you do a Kickstarter project is they ask you, or they tell you to be very upfront about the risks. I was extremely naive. I mean, like this, with hindsight, the one thing I did, which was incredibly naive, was I thought if I went over to Berlin in May, I'd have a finished product by November.
Right.
And I think sort of that was a naivety born of how much information could there be? Like, you know, I thought, like, you know, what I kind of knew. One of the things in communist Germany they used to do is write a Lebenslauf, and it's German for CV. So basically, when someone's on their last legs, they would write their CV, and it would be like almost like a very short chronology of their life and their involvement in the party. Yeah, it's not just a German. Well, it's more a communist German thing, but you know, it's more than a CV. It's kind of like a reflection. Yeah. So I had that in German, and I don't speak German. That's a slight problem. We'll come on to that. But I sort of picked it apart, and I got to figure out, you know, what the dates were, any people that were mentioned, what the locations that are mentioned, and it gave me a broad skeleton of his life. So I knew that I could sort of probably tell a story based around those points. You know, take each point that he mentions and sort of expand it a bit, and then just have this sort of narrative about a boy growing up in Stuttgart that becomes a socialist, that then fights the Nazis, and then fights the Spanish, and then goes to a concentration camp, and then ends up in America. There we go. Biff, baff, boff.
There it is. Yeah. And okay. And so where do you begin this? So you have this sort of reflection, this CV, I guess. Is this your what relics or family heirlooms or text? What is available to you in your base pack? What can you reach for to build this narrative of who this man is before you have to board a plane and really start to dig in?
To be honest, before I went to Germany, the only thing I had was his Lebenslauf. Yeah. Apologies to any Germans listening. And there's a couple of books that he's mentioned in like a small paragraph that I'd seen. And then also he wrote a few books, right, which I have some copies of. Right. Most of which are in German. Some of them were reproduced in other languages like English and French. Right. But they're more, because he was a historian, they're more his histories at a time rather than about him. Right. So in terms of his life, I had very little. Okay. Little as in almost nothing.
Right. So I guess we should begin his story as you know it, I guess, and retell it as you're finding the pieces, you know. Yeah. His name is Albert. What is his second name?
Well, that's the first mystery in the puzzle. So, all right, his name was Albert Schreiner. Right. Schreiner means carpenter in German, so it's a really terrible thing to search for on Google because you just get lots of German carpenter websites. Yeah. So the first piece of the puzzle is him being born. Right. No records at all. Okay. No records at all. I know he was born in August 1892. I do some digging. I forgot the first place I go. So when I raise the money off Kickstarter, the first place I go to is Stuttgart.
How much money did you raise?
About £1,400.
That's good. That's very good going.
It was good going. I completely didn't factor in the costs of travel and actually producing the thing. But right, okay. But I'll cover the costs. It's a start. It's a start. No, right. that got me to Germany. It got me like a week in Germany with 2 days in Stuttgart. Yeah. And 4 or 5 days in Berlin. So yeah, Stuttgart was the start of the problem because, you know, that was the making of him. I knew bits about that, but the records are very, poor.
Yeah.
Not many survive. As a bit of history, Germany up until 1918 was a series of monarchies. So there wasn't really a unified Germany. There was a German Empire, which had Kaiser Wilhelm at the time as the sort of the Kaiser, emperor, basically.
And he's the chap that was assassinated, which set the dominoes.
No, he was.
Oh.
So he was. Kaiser Wilhelm was the Kaiser of Germany.
Right.
Well, Kaiser Wilhelm II. So Europe at this time was basically a series of interrelated families. You had the Habsburgs, I think they're the Habsburgs. You had basically the Austria-Hungary Empire, because that was one empire at the time. You had the English monarchy. You had the Kaiser, and they were all kind of related, but all very jealous of each other. My cousin's got more of Africa than yours has. Or something like, it was very built into this empire, imperial mindset.
Right.
And going back to your point, so the kickoff, and there's a lot more underlying stuff than the assassination, but the assassination was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
That's the one. Yeah,
Franz Ferdinand, not the band. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo as part of a growing political unrest in the Balkans.
Right.
He was the son of the leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
Who had very close relations with Germany, and that's what triggered World War One, which essentially Austria said, we're going to kick off. Germany said, we'll kick off with you. That's kind of what started all that.
Right.
Yeah, so my earlier point was essentially when you're researching somewhere like Stuttgart, you're not researching German history, you're researching Baden-Württemberg, which is the country that used to exist within the German Empire.
Right.
And it means that all the archives are quite disconnected. They're not quite joined up. There's different ways. There's a lot of regional differences. They're all part of a unified Germany now, but it all makes things a little bit more complicated.
And how do they present themselves in the archives? What are they? Are they ledgers? Are they old newspaper clippings? Are they what form do these breadcrumbs take?
So the first breadcrumb was his birth certificate, which we discovered through a very helpful archivist in Glasterhausen, I think, which is just outside Stuttgart where he lived. One thing I gathered was that his dad was a socialist and an alcoholic, family failing. But his dad was a socialist, and at that time socialism was perceived as very dangerous. It was an enemy to this sort of monarchic view of the world.
Right.
And there was very few things like trade unions. So the socialists were seen as causing a lot of unrest. It meant that they had to move, the family, my great-grandfather's family, had to move around a lot for work because as soon as you were blacklisted in an area, you had to find work elsewhere. He was an engineer. So they moved around all over the place in southern Germany. When my great-grandfather was born, they were in Stuttgart.
Right.
And it turns out his birth name wasn't Schreiner. And that was my gut feeling is that was so his dad could get work. He changed his name so he could get work because he was on this blacklist. So they took his wife's maiden name, which was Poser.
Right.
So the reason we knew Albert was born in this village or town on this date, but we couldn't find the record, and it was because the surname had changed. So you can start to see that there's like a political narrative here in the family.
Yeah.
That underpins his existence even before he's born.
Yeah, I love this. This is a deep dive. Yeah. So so you get this, and how do you figure out that the name has changed?
Basically, I got in touch through a friend in Germany to communicate directly with the archivist or whatever in the town, because most archives from that period of time are actually tied into churches.
Right.
So the birth records are actually in the ecclesiastical archives. They're not in like we would have here, like a town archive or a state archive or a county archive. They're actually in these churches.
Right.
And so through a friend that was in southern Germany, or a family friend, because we still have some connections over there, they were able to get in touch with this archivist from Glasterhausen, and we found a record for an Albert on this day, but it's a different name, but the parents' names are the same. So that, I think, sort of at that moment in time, his dad was using a slightly different name, probably to get work in one of the factories in Stuttgart.
Right. Okay. And then do archivists along the way, do they go, oh, I have a friend who works in so-and-so, and you should probably give them a call? Or how helpful are these archivists? Did anyone get involved in did they ever get
not
invested?
In Stuttgart. I mean, Berlin, yes, but also you've got Stuttgart's it's not provincial. It's a big city,
right?
But it's sort of in a sort of quite a regional area. So, understandably, because it is Germany, not a lot of people speak English. It'd be very rude of me to go over there and expect everyone to go, "Hello, Jeeves, have you got anything on Albert Schreiner?" But on the flip hand, I don't speak much German, which is a bit of a challenge. So, generally, in Berlin, it's been better because Berlin's a lot more cosmopolitan. There's a lot younger.
Yeah.
A lot more people speak English, so they were able to help. And the second time, because I went twice to Berlin, the second time I went with a family friend who had been there when my uncle died.
Right.
They lived in Germany, so they were able to come and basically sort of shout at people in German for me and get the things I needed.
Right. That's amazing. So you've figured out that the birth name has changed.
Yeah.
Where is the next breadcrumb?
The next breadcrumb's 1918. So he would have been 18. What's 18 plus 8? 26.
Right.
Because they didn't have a great deal of information in Stuttgart. And I'll show you, though, and again, not great for podcast, but I'm sure Andy can find a way of producing it. So I brought with me...
Cole has brought with
photos,
him...
some family photos and also photos from the archives, some of which are stuck together. So the one photo they had in the archives in Stuttgart was from 1918. Now, this is a time I need to come on to a bit of a history lesson. So I've already said that Germany had it was an empire.
Yes.
It had a monarch, it had a series of country states, each had their own monarch. So there was a Prince of Baden-Württemberg. They were all interrelated, In 1918, Germany had a socialist revolution.
Right.
So the monarchy...
Now, what does a socialist revolution look like?
Well, so in 1917, Russia had a pretty big one.
Right.
So the monarchy at the time, they were overthrown, and the economic and socio-political inequality was seized by the workers and overthrew the government.
Right.
And then in 1918, Germany kind of did the same, but in a slightly less over-exuberant way. But it didn't have quite as strong leadership as the Russians did under Lenin and Trotsky. And it also, in Germany, because it had these monarchy states, it was very fragmented. So it was very difficult to have a unified response to anything.
Right.
But what they did do overnight is have a revolution, which essentially heralded the end of the First World War.
Right.
Which was November the 9th, 1918. I'm fiddling around looking for this photo.
There's a wealth of material in this folder. Yes. This is a real little treasure trove.
So anyway, in the archives in Stuttgart, they had a photo of my great-grandfather in military uniform, and it was the advent, or it was the assembly of the new socialist, the Free People's Republic of Württemberg.
Yeah.
So essentially what had happened is they had had a revolution, they displaced the monarchy in Baden-Württemberg,
right.
And he was appointed the Minister of War for that new government.
Oh wow. And how does he get to this position? Is this is the issue with trying to find someone in very fragmented archives, I guess, isn't it? Well, is it there are big leaps in their life sort of missing?
There's definitely had to be a degree of unpicking to see his story getting up to that point.
Right.
So his life before, say, 1918 is very poorly documented.
Right.
He was born in Stuttgart. He started working when he was 12, and he got a job at a technical college, which basically meant you worked a 12-hour day shift in an engineering factory, and then you went to classes in the evening.
Right.
And that was seen as sort of like an act of, a position of immense privilege to be awarded this. So he was doing this, but on the long side that, he was starting to get into the socialist movement. Now, the socialist movement in Stuttgart, Stuttgart was seen as one of the big hubs outside Berlin of the socialist movement.
Right.
You had very influential people like Clara Zetkin, who was a very early political feminist and mentor of Rosa Luxemburg, who you might have heard of. Rosa Luxemburg, and we'll come on to her because what happens in the November Revolution with her is very important and very tragic.
Right.
But she was seen as the figurehead, along with Karl Liebknecht, of this socialist movement, two idealists who fundamentally believed in the causes of socialism, the abolishment of colonies, the equality between the sexes, the equality between workers, the fundamental cause of a socialist ideology.
Right.
And very independent of what was going on in Russia, because remember, the Russian Revolution hadn't happened yet at this time.
Right.
So there were people like Lenin and Trotsky very much involved in this international dialogue, but the actual conversation was often happening in Germany. And so this is an environment that Albert was growing up in. He became very influenced by it and was communicating a lot with some of its main figures, like Catherine Dunker, I've mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin. And then in 1907, and I don't know about his involvement quite, but in 1907 there was an international congress in Stuttgart for socialism. And it was also the world's first international conference on feminism. So the two were seen as hand in hand, although this was still a very patriarchal society, and Germany's a very patriarchal country. So the women were given a platform, but it was a slightly smaller platform over to one side, sort of thing.
I see. But at least they were.
Oh no, definitely. And the fundamental argument was you couldn't look at trying to peel back inequality without addressing inequalities in race and gender. And the idea of social inequality came down to this idea of one of the biggest points of it was about the problems with colonialism, because essentially it's lining the pockets of the rich. It creates essentially, and we're seeing a lot of this with the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, it objectifies sort of communities around the world. They're a resource to be colonized and taken over. And that's, again, one of the sort of catalysts for World War I, much more than the assassination probably in the Balkans. It was actually just this money grab of Africa and the Caribbean.
Right.
And Asia. So anyway, in Stuttgart, 1907, there's a big congress. All these leading political figures arrive. Albert would have been 15.
Right.
And he's there as part
of very impressionable age.
Yeah, very much. And I think he sort of really takes to heart a lot of what goes on.
Yeah.
This isn't documented. Some of this is conjecture.
Right.
I know he was there at this time. I know he was involved with these people. These people were massively involved in one of the biggest socialist congresses today.
And the rest, you sort of have to paint yourself in a way.
You do. And I think there's a sort of tension I have at trying to be objective and then trying to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
That's more of a storytelling frustration, I suppose, and problems I have with my own confidence rather than necessarily sort of problem with the historical record or what have you.
Yeah.
So 1907, this big socialist congress. In 1912, he becomes a journeyman. Now in Germany, there's a long history of becoming a journeyman, which is essentially when you're doing a craft, like a carpenter or a factory worker or whatever, as soon as you've got the necessary qualifications, you travel and you're given free lodgings and you have to learn about your craft in different places. Wow. So, and it's a tradition that still continues to this day. Some people still do it.
Just makes sense, doesn't it?
It does. And and it sounds silly, but it's almost like Amish, like they have a very particular uniform and a stick that they're recognized. And that's important because it means that they're recognizable, so that if they go to an area, people can offer them lodgings, food, work, etc.
Yeah.
And I think the idea, I don't know how long the period is, I don't know if it's a year or longer, but the idea is you go off and travel and learn more about your craft, but not just get siloed in one particular area of knowledge, that you try and pick up from as many different people as possible.
And what they get at the end of that is not only a well-oiled machine, you'd hope, in their craft, but the byproduct of that is this young person has now got life experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And they know their country a little more. And they probably know who they are a little more.
And I think also it probably teaches a great deal of humility. You know, the fact that you set out with a backpack and a stick from home, and on foot you go to another city, not knowing where you're sleeping that night, where you'll be working tomorrow, where the food's coming from.
It's like being on tour. It's at drumsticks instead,
Back in the tour
Will
bus.
I make it home?
The journeyman.
Yeah, and that is like that's an archetypal plot, isn't it? Throughout all of human storytelling. I mean, it's bloody Lord of the Rings in some ways as well, isn't it?
You know, you've got to travel to find yourself, sort of.
Yeah. And also there is, like you said, you know, the humility side. I'm not big into martial arts, or I don't claim to know anything really about martial arts, but I saw a great interview with Guy Ritchie and other interviews with people that are really into this Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And the old Sick One singer, Ben Kurd, he got really into Brazilian jiu-jitsu while he was in the band. And we would talk at length about it on drives and tell me all about what he just learned. And one of the things that people who really take it seriously like to do is to go to other, I don't know if they're called gyms or dojos or, you know, these Gracie places. And they find that if they're traveling around and they're practicing with other people in different gyms, then that is where they will learn a lot of humility as well, because they may be the best in their particular room at it.
Yeah.
But then you go to somewhere else and someone else can tap you out with their, and the humility comes from finding yourself through failures and experiencing other people's techniques and takes on things. So you might think you're the most badass carpenter in the world, head to the next city and there might be a guy who gives you a technique that absolutely blows your mind and makes you feel like a bloody ape.
And I think it gives you perspective as well. I think sort of, I go back to your martial arts analogy, you know, I think sort of one thing martial arts does is it teaches you about, it's almost meditative, you know, about reflection, about humility, about your place in a wider universe. I mean, this is like, and you can see it today. And we had a brief chat about social media. You know, the biggest danger is to fall into a silo. Yeah. You know, because then on the one hand, like you can see why people do it. It's comfortable. Yeah. But on the other hand, you end up with silos are impervious. You know, knowledge doesn't come in and it doesn't go out, and you end up just having this noise. Yeah. Reassuring noise. The echo chamber. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I found that during the last elections is that the algorithm had my Facebook algorithm obviously knows that I'm a bloody left winger, and all I could see on the day of the election was red. Yeah. Labour Party this, Jeremy Corbyn that. And it feeds into my age. It feeds into the fact that my networks are very, very much the creative industry, which are inherently left-leaning. And Jeremy Corbyn, his version of Labour was leaning that way. And I was convinced. I was like, we got this. This is going to happen. This is going to be interesting. There's going to be a new political system, or politics is going to change. And then Labour got absolutely annihilated at the polls. And that was a moment where I was like, I cannot trust social media anymore, because it funnels you off into these, these silos, these echo chambers. I mean, it capitalizes on what you find comforting. Yeah, because and I think it will do that if you were really into the history of WWF or wrestling or whatever. That's all you'd see, because its job is to keep you on the app. Yeah, it's you know, I mean, there's various conversations at the moment about it, but you know, the fundamental thing with it, and I remember going to a talk about this about 10 years ago in the web development community. Yeah, if you're not paying for something, you're the product. So yes, that was in the Social Dilemma recently when I watched it. So you know, if a company is sharing your images, and I know as someone that hosts websites, the transmission of information, images, videos online is very expensive. You know, there's a lot of money that goes into storing this information, sharing it, the bandwidth that's involved. Where's that money coming from? And the only way it's coming from is selling your information. Yeah. And so it's going to make you warm and fuzzy by sharing stuff that it thinks you already know, because that makes you use it more. Yeah. And actually, you know, like going back to what we're talking about, I can see people think a lot of this stuff's new, and it isn't. Right. You know? It's on the screen. You can see how the media is controlled through large parts of human history, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's a new medium. Yeah. But it's not a new phenomenon. So he's traveling around. He's on tour, let's say. He's on tour. He ends up in the sort of the southern eastern part of Germany, Freiburg, and he's called up for military service. So one of the things that they also had, as well as this journeyman thing, is they had conscription. So you had to do your service. You had to do 2 years military service. Now, again, because Germany was broken up into states, they didn't have a German army. They had regional armies. So he signed up to the Royal Saxon Army. Well, signed up, was conscripted in 1912.
Someone signed him up.
So he was 20 years old. He was signed up to a machine gun corps in the Royal Saxon Army.
And what year is this?
1912.
1912. So a machine gun corps is going to be a very different corps than what it would be now, because I guess the machine gun is a very new technology in military history.
Yeah, I think they had been around, but there was definitely adapting to it. But also, ultimately, the machine gun would be the primary weapon of World War One.
Yeah.
And with that primary weapon, not only becomes, and obviously you're speaking to Julia, it's not only about a new weapon, it's about a new means of warfare, because you've got to circumnavigate that new weapon.
Yeah.
So, he becomes part of it. And I think because of his engineering background, that's why he ended up in the machine gun corps, because I've spoken to military historians. These are very temperamental pieces of equipment that break all the time.
Right.
So having a guy that knows one end of the other from a screwdriver and a spanner is going to be really helpful in a military situation. But bear in mind also that Germany is not in any conflict at this time.
Right. So it's not a big, bad, scary calling. It's something he's probably been prepared for a while. That's a good option that.
Yeah, well, no, I don't think it's an option. I think he had to do it.
Right.
But actually, I wouldn't say it was cushy, but I don't think it was a pretty terrifying experience to be down in Freiburg, sort of the hilly southern eastern parts of Germany, sort of being in a machine gun corps.
Yeah.
Probably just
sounds kind of cool.
Taking apart and reassembling guns a lot.
Yeah. Do you want to come? That was why I joined Army Cadets. Yeah. It's like, you want to go play with guns? Yes. I mean, guns are horrible when they're in the wrong hands.
They're used,
but as intended. But generally, I think guns are they're fun if you're using them for fun.
I think it's very difficult not to be in immense awe of them.
Yeah, you have to respect them
as a sort of as a tool and as something that they're horrific. As a pacifist, I'm absolutely abhorred by them. But I think mechanically and they're ingenious, and they wield immense power.
Yes.
And it's very difficult not to be awestruck by something that wields immense power.
Yeah. Have you ever fired a weapon?
Shotgun.
Yeah, that's an experience, isn't it?
Pigeon sort of nonsense.
And how did you feel about that?
What, was I grieving for the
No. Well, no, I mean, some people were so that they...
No, I've always had... my parents were pacifists. They used to run a peace festival. They used to take me to Glastonbury as a kid.
Right.
They hated... I was never allowed toy guns, even like cap guns.
Yeah.
Which is the one thing that's going to push someone to be really interested in guns.
Yeah. It's this forbidden thing, right?
Forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
I remember getting bollocking in Coventry. We went shopping in Coventry. How exciting. And buying a cap gun and getting absolutely laid into by my parents on the car journey home. We're spending 79p on a cap gun or whatever,
See, there's a start. I mean, when I was a kid, I basically had an armory. Essentially, I had a box full of toy guns of various. Some were plastic, some were metal. Some were this and that. Some were this and that. Yeah, and I loved it. And obviously I've seen what guns can do. And I grew up with guns in the house, and dad owned shotguns all throughout my childhood.
You tooled up,
and sometimes they would appear, and I would be able to hold it and look at it, and the moment I did something wrong, it went away.
Yeah,
I remember one day he gave me 20 minutes.
It's about like
respecting the weapon.
So the worst thing you can do with a child is tell them something's forbidden.
Yeah.
The second worst thing you could do is give them unfettered access without teaching them respect and responsibility.
Yeah.
About it. There's a good halfway house, I think.
Yeah.
I was one extreme.
Yeah.
I
could point it at the wall and go, pam, 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 I got it. Right? But there was this one time he spent 20 minutes telling me, and they would come down every sort of 6 months or something, and it would be like, it would be, you hold it.
You'd clean them blindfolded.
It was like a thing.
Table.
Yeah, it was like a thing though. It was like, now I get to hold it again. Do you know what I mean? And look at it, feel the weight. And I remember once he spent like 20 minutes, half an hour telling me about it, how it works, safety catch, all this, all proper, like obviously not loaded or anything, made safe. My sister comes home from school, swing it right around, point it at her, straight back in the gun cabinet in the safe. And that's how it has to be. Yeah. As soon as you fuck it up, it goes away.
It's got to be
That's the only way you do it. Is that. And even when I was in cadets, I remember being led down with my SA-80 rifle, and if I couldn't 7 or 5 times in a row make the weapon safe with the 7-point check, breech barrel gun, magazine, breech barrel gun. I think breech.
I'll put the gun back in the box now.
So basically, yeah, right. So and if you couldn't do that 5 times, you didn't go on the range. You didn't get anywhere near a blank, And so, I mean, I've had a different experience to a lot of people with firearms or weapons because they've always been around, and I've always respected them. I've had it drummed into me, literally drilled into me. So I don't mind a bit of fun with a weapon, as long as everyone around me knows the score as well. Because I'll be that guy who'll fucking take it off you as well. But yeah, we've digressed again. So he goes to the machine gun corps, where it all sounds quite fun.
This cushy non-war thing, and then, as you've raised earlier, it all kicks off.
Right.
So in 1914, he's sent to the Western Front. So he's in. I've actually had to do a lot of digging as well because there's different regional armies. The archives are all very disparate. It's not like in England, for example, where you have the sort of the centralized military records.
Right.
I think at Kew Gardens. In Germany, they were all moved around, and also the added frustration is that when Hitler tried to one of his exercises as a nationalist, unsurprisingly, was to try and unify and consolidate these disparate states. He moved a lot of the archives into Berlin from all these regions, and lo and behold, it was bombed to buggery, and a lot of the records are lost.
And this is the issue with a pre-digital era, isn't it? Is that if you wanted to lose or destroy information, you'd have to find every single copy of it, wouldn't you? And destroy it, and you wouldn't just be able to hit, Control Alt Delete or whatever it is, whatever the shortcut is, or take a hammer to a hard drive and set fire to the building. You'd have to find every copy of it, or set it on fire, or
it's a blessing and a curse. I mean, the digital age is fantastic, but it's also, I'm not very disciplined about controlling my online presence.
Yeah,
but with children, I'm now starting to think, I see how flippant they are.
Yeah.
And that causes me some concern. But then on the flip side, it's really annoying when you know that there was one record that can tell you a massive part of your family history.
Yeah.
And it was bombed, So there's 2 records. So I know he went to the Western Front, and I know that because each regiment had its own history. So although they don't mention the individual members of the regiment, and I know which regiment he was in, 182nd, I can trace the movements of that regiment through different conflicts.
Right.
Mostly at the Western Front for 2 years. So Belgium, the Somme.
Yeah.
But the first Somme, not the second one. Yeah, so moving around, mostly the battered trenches of Northwest Europe.
Right.
As a machine gunner. Probably annihilating lots of people.
Right. So you think he saw his fair share of horrors?
Yeah, I think it would have been horrific. And I think there was probably a great deal of tension because he was, and this is what really frustrates me. So he was a patriot, and people always think that socialists aren't patriotic because our notion of patriotism is tied up with nationalism and in some cases the monarchy.
Right.
Yeah, a Union Jack waving or whatever. That doesn't, being a socialist just means that you love your country and you want it to change. It doesn't mean you want it, you hate your country. You hate the status quo, let's say.
Right.
So the reason I say that is that he fought in the First World War and was massively proud of being German. And although he may not have believed the cause, he wanted to support his country in that endeavour.
Right.
But what happens in Germany over this time? So there's a very vocal number of people. I mentioned some of them before, like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Karl Liebknecht is a MP, a politician in Germany.
Right.
that are starting to complain. You know, they're not only complaining about the futility of the First World War, like what's the end game? We are losing thousands of people here. Also, our economy's knackered.
Yeah.
The industry that we were very strong at, you know, because Germany was the front line of automobile manufacturer, cameras, chemical engineering. It was really strong in. So a lot of the reason you've got great cameras from Germany is because not only were they fantastic engineers of the cameras, but also fantastic engineers of the chemicals needed to make photographs.
Right, I see.
So, you know, you've got this fantastic engineer and it's all being diverted into the war effort.
Right.
And all the money needed to divert that in, because you haven't got customers, you know, no one's buying these bullets. It's being paid for by the state. So the state's having to remove its expenditure elsewhere.
Right.
Because actually up to a point, like there's a history of socialist struggle in Germany that required some quite big changes. So they were very early on had a minimum wage, and they very early on introduced things like holidays, public holidays, staff holidays. You know, like I say staff holidays. You know, like, but actually they were very interested in investing in the workers having a sense of being supported by the state,
right?
Because that kept them calm. But what happened is that that was the financial investment that was needed for that wasn't possible during conflict, because all that money had to be diverted into. So you not only had this struggling economy, you had restless workers then, because all the stuff that they needed to help them thrive was being taken away from them.
Right.
So you start seeing big protests. You start in around 1916, and bear in mind that this is halfway through what we now know was the First World War.
Yeah.
So you're getting people arrested for being, and you start to see the state clamp down on dissent, people complaining about things, people suggesting that there can be a different way of doing things. That's treason, essentially. That's treated as treason. So people are imprisoned for protesting about the war effort. In 1916, Albert's at the Somme, and like I said, there's two Somme, like there's a 1916, I think 1917 one.
Right.
He was in the Somme in 1916, and then his regiment is pulled over to the Eastern Front, to Romania.
Right.
So they go there to suppress an uprising in Romania supported by the Russians, because this is a conflict happening on two sides. You've got the Russians, which are essentially at this time fighting with the French and the English, and then the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans fighting. And then also there's other battles going on with, for example, the Turks and what have you, which is why it's called the First World War. You know, it's a world war, all these different socio-political people getting involved. But it's a war that's happening for Germany on two fronts. The Western Front, which is what we all think of when we think of the First World War, you know, people in trenches. Mm. But also the Eastern Front, which is very much a different kind of landscape, different kind of war. It's much faster moving.
Right.
It's more sort of track and trace, and it's moving around a lot. It's not like just bedding in and sort of
right. It's not trench warfare.
You're not fighting over square inches of a map. You know,
right.
You're really trying to capture territory quickly.
Right. And what were the tactics used in that sort of blitz bombing? Or
well, yeah. So blitzkrieg comes later, but yeah, it is very compared to what Albert would have been used to, which is sitting in a trench for months on end, probably moving 100 meters at a time.
Yeah.
They are moving miles a day.
Right.
Chasing Romanians, which essentially have come into a World War conflict on horseback with cutlasses and rifles.
Right.
Which on the Romanian plains is fine, but then when you're up against machine guns, and it's not, you're not going to last very long.
Okay. So as what Julian said in episode 1, when I spoke to him, that would be in a high attrition rate. Hmm. Which is a chilling.
It's a very technical term, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a coldness to it.
It's a sort of, it's a casualty defined by economics.
Yeah.
Rather than the human story.
Yeah. Okay, and so you find out he's been put into the which front was this? The Eastern Front.
The Eastern Front. I do have a photo of him at the Eastern Front.
Excellent.
So in the centre of that picture is Albert. So that is shortly after he's promoted.
Okay, so I'm looking at a picture of 5 uniformed gentlemen. Albert is in the middle.
So these are mostly officers, but
right, okay.
They're working class officers. So in Germany's a very hierarchical society.
Right.
So, or certainly at that time it was. So essentially, if you were working class, it's like a non-commissioned officer. If you were working class, because the amount of casualties, the sheer amount of casualties in World War I, there was a need to promote people up into the rank of officer.
Right.
But they fundamentally couldn't have them have the rights and entitlements of being an officer.
Right.
So there's a German phrase, and I can't remember. Technically, it's like Offizierstellvertreter or something. So it's basically like a non-ranked officer. It's an officer in name,
a non-commissioned officer, which is all the way up to a regimental sergeant major, I think, in the British Army.
It was just in this context. It was basically to have someone with a bit of authority in the troops if someone else got capped.
Right. To use a street term.
Yeah. Capped in their ass in Romania in 1916.
He's got quite the jawline, hasn't he, Albert?
He has a striking jawline, and what has become known in the family as the Schreiner eyebrows.
He looks quite serious. There's some seriousness in his eyes.
Yeah, so I can't work out when that photo was taken. I've spoken to some military historians that have been able to identify some of the uniform.
Yeah. Because the uniforms are inconsistent. Or are these officers from different parts of Germany here?
No, they were all Saxon army. The reason that they're inconsistent is people are actually wearing them differently. So, and this is because this is in a conflict zone. So what's happening is very often people will cover their rankings.
Right, because you're the obvious target. If I'm a sniper, I'm looking for in bloody what's his name from Dad's army. And bloody Pike comes along and salutes, second lieutenant. Again, as Julian would say, some chinless wonder. Yeah. I'm going to go and shoot this guy first.
Yeah, so there's a lot of effort that's required in covering up the symbols of rank, but in a way that also kind of respects. And also they wear their hats differently and things like that. So this photo, but he's central in this photo. I know it's from around 1916, and what I do know is he's been promoted in that year. There is in his Lebenslauf, which I mentioned, he writes that he was promoted in 1916.
Right.
On the Western Front.
Okay. What for? Just because he was filling the do you know, the void?
Could have been filling a void. As in everyone else above him had been
killed,
capped to Carlins. It could be that he's shown
prowess.
Potential and prowess. I think from what I can gather from what I've researched, he's a very disciplined person.
Yeah.
I think that was probably seen as a good thing. And he's a very intelligent person. He's come in with the working class troops. Mm-hmm. And I think sort of an aptitude or ability to sort of think about very intense situations is probably seen as quite, moderate skill to have in armed conflict.
And knowing sort of what we do about his later life, it wouldn't be a stretch to believe that possibly he was a good leader or interested in leadership.
He seems to fall into leadership than ask for it. So, but that going back to your point, I think he probably is quite a natural leader. But then there were also records when he's in the Spanish Civil War about his attitude to the troops, and he's seen as not aloof but disinterested in the troops that he's commanding then.
Right. So I guess we'll get onto that.
Yeah, we'll come on to that
in a bit. But I guess the first thing that jumps out to me there is this guy's seen enough death, enough war.
This is 20, so that's 20 years later.
Right.
So
and why are you
now?
Yeah, and why are you investing in guys you're going to be pulling the dog tags off of in 2 days?
Possibly, yeah.
Jaded.
Yeah. So 1916, Romania. He's promoted to the Western Front, moves to Romania in like you say, not technically blitzkrieg, but a rapid series of advancements on the Eastern Front. There's a point to prove as well, twofold. One is that Romania has massive oil reserves,
right?
So that was seen as sort of an objective,
right?
Because Germany was running on empty at this time. Well, not running on empty, but the resources were getting scarce.
Yeah.
And then secondly, there was a lot of Western generals that had not bad experience. They basically been sent to the Eastern Front as a punishment for poor performance on the Western Front. So they had a point to prove. So
right.
Essentially there was a rapid series of advances. They got essentially to Budapest from the Transvaal Mountains, which is where Dracula's from, obviously the real character Dracula.
Yeah.
But in that process, Albert is shot. He's shot in the face.
Right.
In manoeuvres. And I've been able to work out, bizarrely, through someone that has that regimental record, and cross-referencing that, the only military record I can find of Albert is a record of his injury.
Right.
Which isn't reported until 1917. But basically doing some cross-referencing with someone else, a military historian, we've worked out that almost to the day in December 1916, where and when he would have been injured.
Right. And where and when was this?
So this was in the Târnă Roșu Pass in Romania.
Right.
In rapid manoeuvres. He was shot in the jaw. Do you know much about the German language?
No, I do not. I've been to Germany a bit.
On the one hand, it seems quite straightforward. But then you get incidences where they just stick lots of words together and don't worry about spaces, and that becomes a new word.
Right.
And one of them is the injury he had. And I'd have to look it up, but it's like basically the German word. There is a German word for like jaw wound by bullet.
Right.
It's just like about 25 letters long.
Really?
And that's what's mentioned. It's like in this sort of inventory of casualties, and it's like it's so sobering and depressing to see, because it's like a list, it's a page, and you can look at it and you find his name and you realize, oh, it's a page of German casualties, and then you realize that's one of 200 pages of a week's worth of injuries, and it's just like, oh my god,
shot in the jaw of all places.
Well, it could be worse.
This is a piece of his history that I do know from reading from the website earlier. A year later, he's married, right?
He met a childhood sweetheart in the Socialist Youth Party in Stuttgart. So Emma Schreiner, and they had this childhood sweetheart. He goes home to convalesce. Basically, he goes back to Stuttgart with his injury, and he's out of action for at least a year. We know that in terms of the military, he's out of action. He's recuperating. At that, and I think it's 1918. Actually, he marries, because he's eventually called back to war. So he convalesces, he recovers, he's sent back to the Western Front, because basically everything's going tits up. Right. Germans are losing the war. The people at the top know this is happening. They panic. So they they're sending people from hospital beds and with limps to the front to try and sort of stem the flow.
Did you say wood limbs?
With wounded limbs.
Oh, I thought you said wood limbs. Sorry,
he gets sent to the Western Front I'd have to look it up. 1917 or 18 anyway.
After he's married?
Well, no, I got a feeling he comes back on leave and marries after being sent out again. But anyway, married, war, a year between
jaw hanging off,
/killers.
Yeah.
So,
do you get any sense of any? I mean, it's probably quite traumatic getting shot in the face, isn't it? Any evidence in records of him struggling with any PTSDs or anything like that, or would that be way too personal, way too detailed?
I think partly, so in context, he only writes once with emotion. Like, there's only one record of him writing with emotion.
Wow.
And partly that is, it's really fascinating, and I've had it translated. He writes a poem, basically, from prison in 1919. And that becomes more striking because he's part of this very patriarchal society where men don't expose emotions. Right. Which I think it'd be safe to say that the Germans probably are particularly around this time. Mm. But also, he's a historian, so everything he tries to write subsequently becomes very as an observer, rather than a participant. Yeah, a very third person. Exactly, yeah. So I don't know. He makes reference in the poem to his experiences in conflict. You can see that there's a rawness there. Yeah. Even if it's just in passing in a few words. Like, he talks about his experiences in the front and dreaming of girls with flowers in their hair and the sort of the noises of the guns and things like that. So I think it would be almost impossible not to have been affected by those experiences. Obviously, now at that time we had no idea about PTSD and trauma. Right. Yeah. and the psychological impacts. And that was seen as, if you were affected adversely by these experiences, you were seen as weak.
Right.
That's just the reality of the time that we're talking about.
Yeah. And so you think he's come back on leave, and you believe that he's married. Oh, what's her name again? Emma. And then you think he's gone back out to the Western.
So what I think happens, and I don't have the chronology in front of me. So he gets called up to the Western Front again. So he goes to fight in trench warfare again, at a time where Germany are basically massively losing.
Right.
And he gets sent home on leave and marries Emma. But he gets sent home for he doesn't get sent home for this reason, but all this time where he's, certainly after his injury and probably before, he's in touch with his socialist friends in Stuttgart.
Right.
And they are sending him leaflets and pamphlets about the problems with war, the war, and the struggles in Germany. And you've got to be really careful about this stuff. If he's caught with this stuff, it's treason. And if you'll get caught with treason, you get shot. So,
wow.
He's having to be really guarded, but he's also observing on the front line a lot of the disenfranchisement of the people that are fighting. Who are we fighting for? Why? The Kaiser's up in his palace, trying to sort of conquer Europe, and we're the ones that are getting shot at and stuff. So there's a balance there to be found that he knows. I feel that he knows that there is a tide turning. And that's partly because Germany are losing the conflict, but partly, like I said before, the Russian Revolution the year before. There's a sense of optimism that something similar might happen in Germany.
Right. So the times that, the winds of change might be blowing.
Yeah.
Is that a Scorpions reference? Damn.
It's also a Scorpions reference that was massively used in the reunification of Germany.
Really?
There we go.
Well, it makes me look clever.
Gorky Park. So he goes back to Stuttgart. But not only to marry Emma, but he's given instructions. So he's being told by the independent socialists. I don't want to get too involved in the really complex sociopolitical spiderweb of German history, but essentially at this time there's two socialist parties. There's a Socialist Party Germany, the SPD. And then there's an independent socialist party, the Splitters,
right?
Who basically thought the other ones had got fat and on their sort of troughs of. You can see a lot of origins in the problems with left-wing politics in this history.
Yes.
Everyone's idea of left-wing politics is different to every other person in left-wing politics' idea of left-wing politics.
Whereas the right wing sort of solidifies and hardens.
Yeah, they just galvanise over cash in the media. So
yeah. It's sort of helpless, isn't it? Yeah. It's a hopeless thing.
Anyway, this People's Front of Judea that had formed in Germany, the independent socialist,
the real independence
party, the USPD. So they set up basically because the Socialist Party, which was sort of saying all the things it should be saying, but not actually acting on it.
Yeah.
So when it came to voting in Parliament to financially support the war, because it was a democracy still, even though they had a Kaiser, they still needed Parliament to authorise the allocation of war credits, i.e. paying out the public purse to spunk some money on some guns.
Yeah.
They were still required a democratic approval.
Right.
And all throughout the war, the Socialist Party signed up to that. They passed those credits.
Right.
The exception being Karl Liebknecht, who was arrested.
Why do I know that name?
He was a very prominent socialist in Germany. Him and Rosa Luxemburg very often talked together because they were friends, if not lovers. I know that she had lovers throughout the Socialist Party. That sounds like making a slag, but no, she wasn't. She was personally invested in her politics. She had lovers in the party like Leo Georgish, I can't say his name, and Clara Zetkin's son. But yeah, so those two, you will hear when you hear about German socialist politicians of the early 20th century, you will most likely hear Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg.
Right. Okay.
And he was the only MP that opposed the war credits and was arrested because of it.
Not very democratic, then.
No, not towing the party/country line. All of which is a long-winded way of saying that Albert was a member of the USPD, which is the Independent Socialist Party, but he had also become part of what was called the Spartacus League. And the Spartacus League was this underground socialist movement.
Right.
That sort of were anonymously printing pamphlets against the war effort. And
this is punk rock time.
Yeah. This is people chattering in the cellars, the beer cellars, and the back corridors of Berlin. Yeah. And he signs up to this. In fact, he's one of the earliest members, along with, I'm really terrible, as we've discussed, I'm really terrible with names, so I'm forgetting to remember all these people.
We are drinking as well.
So he signs up with these people, and one of the things he's instructed to do is that when he gets back to Stuttgart, this is something I don't understand. So he was in the Freiburg army in Saxony, but he goes back to the Stuttgart barracks, and he's charged with getting prepared for a revolution. So he has to go into the barracks, essentially desert from the army because it's not his army, but sort of blag his way into the barracks and find sympathetic ears to then get ready for revolution.
Sounds like a charge they make up on the spot. What am I guilty of? You're going to start, you're trying to start, you're going to get ready for a revolution. Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah.
Put that on the document. He's getting ready for revolution.
He's a very naughty boy. He's got lots of pamphlets.
Yeah. What is this literature?
Yeah, so he basically goes to the barracks in Stuttgart and he's told to prepare the troops for war.
Right.
And a war by the Germans against the Germans.
Civil war.
Revolutionary war. So and that happens November the 9th, 1918. I'm not quite sure. Well, I actually know. No, there's a genesis of this. So essentially, Germany knows it's losing the war effort, and its admirals decide at the last minute to try and have one last hurrah and launch an attack on the Royal Naval frigates.
Right.
And this is Heligoland, which you might hear it on the shipping forecast.
Right.
But yeah, so there's preparations to go and essentially have one last hurrah, and knowing full well that most of the fleet are going to get destroyed.
Right.
And the sailors rebel and they're arrested. They say there's no point. What is the point? So they're arrested, and it causes a mini revolution in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in the northwest of Germany. And what happens is basically the local socialists demand the release of these sailors, and it happens. And then over a period of days, hundreds and thousands turn up. And this is seen as like a spark. It's seen as because people are talking about this, even though it's not like the internet and stuff. This news gets around incredibly fast to the point that...
How does it do that? Word of mouth?
I'm not entirely sure. I think sort of word of mouth, printed material, but in a very short period of time, phones, obviously. I think in a very short period of time, and I'm talking 2 or 3 days, that word has got around across the whole of Germany, and people are preparing to have a unified insurrection on the 9th of November.
So people were ready then, essentially. Yeah. This is like everyone is a match head, and one is sparked off, and they're all ready and in place.
Yeah.
All they need is the green light.
Yeah. Although it's still a minority of people that are involved in these conversations, because again, it's highly treasonous, because what they're talking about is overthrowing the monarchy.
Right. Okay.
And
it's the equivalent of us marching up to Windsor in taking the Queen out.
Demanding the Queen go off. Bugger off.
Bugger off, yeah. Okay.
I want your nice cushy palace. And Legoland.
So a real revolution is
real revolution, and it happens overnight on the 9th of November. I can't remember exactly why it's that day or what triggers that day. If you start to look into German history, it's quite amusing that the 9th of November crops up a lot.
Right.
The reunification of Germany is the 9th of November.
And we almost had Guy Fawkes'
a few days before, yeah.
Remember the 5th of November.
Yeah.
And what is it? It must be easier to whisper when the nights draw in.
Yeah, people just get pissed off with the darker days, don't they?
They go, right, we're going to do it now.
They won't see us coming.
November's a shady, surreptitious time. Yeah, interesting. It is interesting that date comes up then. So what do you think the prevalence of that date is?
I think once it becomes a very significant date in a calendar. It becomes something to pin on.
Right.
Like in America, it's Independence Day. There's such a cognitively present date in everything that it becomes easier to do something on a day that everyone remembers.
Yeah.
I suppose it makes it easy to predict for. Like, they're revolting again.
Yeah.
Right.
Revolt.
Yeah. 3rd of November, maybe we'll think about getting ready. So
yeah, they're like, right, we've got Halloween out the way, we've had our fun, now we get serious, and then we'll all be good for Christmas. That's how it goes. Okay, so revolution is coming. November the 8th. 9th. Then what?
So in Stuttgart, where Albert is, there's a bloodless revolution. So it's the only one, and all the cities across Germany have the same thing.
Yeah.
Essentially, the soldiers or workers rise up, usually a combination of the two, and overthrow the monarchies in those regions.
Right.
And seize power.
Right.
They form governments in the space of 24 hours.
Okay.
And it's usually a combination of the two different socialist parties. So in Stuttgart or Baden-Württemberg, they set up a free republic. The prince, who's also Wilhelm II, is basically marched from his palace and given safe passage to a family pile somewhere. But essentially the symbolic seat of his power is taken over by the socialists. The red flag is raised. And they have their first government meeting that day. And there's a photograph of them all, including Albert, having their first government meeting on that day. And
do you have that?
I do.
It's that big one.
No, it's that tiny one.
Oh, the tiny
I have a big
one.
one somewhere. Half an hour.
Right, now don't tell me which one Albert is.
I'll tell you.
Far right.
Far right.
Got him. All right, so there's 8 gentlemen here. Oh, they're all named. Lovely. So yeah, they're basically, I'm looking at a black and white picture of 8 gentlemen. Some of them have really impressive beards, facial hair, some balding. There's a character at the back. It looks like he could be a hitman, some sort of like mob assassin guy. Anyway, but yeah, okay. So this is very much what you'd expect from a photo of this period, isn't it? It's 8 very serious men.
And a mix.
All wearing black.
I think it's important to mention there's a mix of old and young men.
Right, yeah, no, okay.
So the old men are the status quo. They're the Socialist Party. The younger men, so there's Arthur Crispian. I don't know who that one is.
He's the one to the left of Schreiner.
Yeah. And Albert's the Minister of War. So he because he was responsible for the soldiers, which was the linchpin of that uprising.
Right.
He becomes the Ministry of War, the Kriegsminister.
So I like the fact that you said that there is a mixture of ages here.
Still all men.
Still all men, unfortunately. This bodes well for the wisdom, I guess, of this group of men, is that they respect the older guys and what they have to say, and the older guys know that these things need to be implemented by younger men who are probably far more credible to the people than these older chaps.
I mean, they're the old guard. So
right.
Albert and the others would have grown up studying the writings of these older people. Because these were all, although they're not necessarily academics, they all were very involved in the socialist movement.
Right.
They would have written a lot.
So these were his rock stars.
I think he very much looked up to them.
Right.
I think he was frustrated with them to some extent, particularly.
That's interesting, though. That is because that adds a level of. He's not putting them above. He's not idolizing them, pedestaling them. It means that he's definitely very socialist.
I think he's a young idealist, and so whilst he recognises his roots and the teachings of the people that have come before him, he's frustrated with the world he inhabits and wants to change it.
Right.
And particularly having seen hundreds of thousands of people die for essentially a conquest, rather than looking at what's going on at home.
Yeah.
That just underpins it even more. What was already there. The war for me crystallizes everything that had been leading up to that point.
Right.
He always had these socialist ideals, but the war really set those into action and made it, I suppose to some extent, if he'd been shot in the face, he's got nothing to lose. I mean, obviously he's recently got married, but this is the genesis not only of who he becomes as a being, but also him making very important decisions that his personal life is less important than the bigger picture.
Right. So he's committed himself fully to the cause. Where does that line then with patriotism and nationalism? There's that blurring again, I guess, isn't there?
Well, I think what all the socialists in Germany want at this time is a better Germany.
Right.
And I think also they probably don't want the parochialism of the regions.
Right.
Because therein lies various inequalities, essentially. If Berlin or Hamburg or Frankfurt, whatever, that's where all the money is, then that becomes the centres of wealth, as well as the centres of poverty. I think as a socialist, their ideals are probably that a unified Germany would be able to share those spoils more equally amongst the people.
Right. And so here he is. He's having this picture with the people he looks up, his mentors, maybe his heroes. What year is this again, sorry?
1918.
1918. Then where? Then where do we go? And this is you said Minister of War, right?
Minister of War.
And now where do we go?
8 days later, he resigns.
Oh.
Because the cabinet that he is part of are made up of the two different socialist factions, and they can't see eye to eye.
Right.
And this isn't just a Stuttgart thing, you can see it in Berlin. So okay. I have to briefly explain what happens in Berlin. So on the 9th of November, also in Berlin, the Kaiser abdicates. So Kaiser Wilhelm II knows the revolution is coming. He abdicates.
Right. So he gives the throne.
He concedes the throne to the state.
Right.
And Karl Liebknecht, who is ultra-socialist, the independent socialist, he has recently been released from prison. He tries to they know that he's going to claim this as a victory for his party.
Right.
And by I say they, what I mean is the socialists in government, the ones that have cowtailed the Kaiser to this point. So they try and seize the opportunity to say this is their revolution, even though it really wasn't. And that's the start of these interfighting between the two socialist parties. And it escalates in Berlin in December of that year. In Stuttgart they fall out really early, but I think that's more of an interpersonal thing. There's a much bigger driving wedge that comes between them in December, which is this battle for power of the Reichstag, the seat of parliament in Berlin.
Right.
Because the seat of power in Berlin is the seat of power of Germany.
I've been to the Reichstag. It's a beautiful building. I've not actually been in it. I'd like to have gone to the top.
See the eagle.
Into the dome. So he's resigned.
He's resigned, but the broader picture is that what happens is that there is a socialist government formed, but it's of these two factions that can't really see eye to eye.
Right.
And this kind of escalates into a massive falling out, and by falling out, I mean a civil war.
Right.
In Berlin. It's called the Berlin skirmishes, but essentially it's a military seize for power.
Right.
Between the different factions and the police. Just before that, there is a sort of call. So the word communist comes from the notion of communes, essentially these devolved centres of administration that are sort of, politically, economically and socially part of a whole, but independent and responsible for an area.
Right.
A bit like a town council, you might say.
Yeah.
So the idea of communism comes from this idea of communes, this distributed equality, with a central message that is devolved. And one of the things that they were keen to do when the German Revolution happened was to set up these councils, so workers and soldiers' councils throughout the country. So each area, rather than being controlled by a political body, was instead controlled by the people, the workers, i.e. the soldiers and the workers. Every area had their own workers and soldiers' councils. And Albert was the leader of the soldiers' council in Stuttgart.
Right.
So there's a big meeting in December where a lot of these tensions are starting to build up between the different socialist factions. So Albert goes up, I think probably filled with this sense of optimism because this is the starting point. The revolution's happened, the dirty work's been done, now we lay the foundations for what happens next.
Right.
And it's been organised in a way that gives the impression that actually everyone gets a say, which is, as someone that works on a council level, probably realises the worst thing ever. But
doing things via committee
in those meetings, yeah. But it's an opportunity for all the councils to get together, air their grievances, talk about the opportunities, and make decisions. but it's a smokescreen. It's all essentially just for show. It really, there's a couple of guys behind the scenes that are running it for their own gains. Not necessarily material gains, just their ideo-political gains. That's, what's his name? Ebert and Scheidemann.
Right.
They're basically two people that seized power after the revolution and sort of like, this is exactly what we wanted all along. But actually, they were just sort of really canny men that were just sort of waiting on power, like waiting for their opportunity to seize power. And this was it. And it all comes to the fore with big skirmishes. Essentially, when the revolution happened, a lot of sailors were brought in to sort of militarily represent the Socialist Party. The leaders of the socialist movement feel that they're not necessary and they're actually a threat. So they insist on them being cleared out the city. There's fights ensue. And then, socialists fighting socialists. It's just like, as they always do.
Right.
And then that happens. And then the right... it's very hard to unpick this without having to go into lots of detail. But essentially what happens is they have a massive falling out. And the falling out culminates in a seize of power from the mainline socialists, the new Labour, let's say, the new Labour. So obviously Blair didn't round up people and assassinate them, but that's essentially what they did. The Freikorps, which was essentially mercenaries that come back from the Western and Eastern fronts, unemployed but still armed, were appointed as a sort of a mercenary army to support the government and fight off insurrection. And they were given a lot of freedom to do what they felt needed to be done to control these insurgents. Right. And Albert was one of these people that was seen as an insurgent. So over the period of December to January, a lot of the people that have been sort of driving the revolution and essentially sort of triggering it and seeing it through to its execution were rounded up.
Right.
And arrested. And Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were essentially they were the figureheads of this far left movement, right? The Spartacus League, were assassinated. Right. They were arrested and murdered by these Freikorps, these right wing mercenaries, because they were right wing. They were a nationalist militia who were disgruntled with the loss of the monarchy and also felt that there essentially the revolution undermined Germany's ability to win the war. Right. It was unpatriotic.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And then what?
So that's that. So Albert's arrested. He gets sent to the military prison in Baden-Württemberg. So he is sent there without charge. He is at a meeting and they are rounded up by the police and, well, not the police, the military, and sent to a military prison.
So is he seen as some sort of enemy of the state or something?
Exactly that.
Point? Yeah.
Exactly that. I mean, you see it across Germany at this time that essentially the people that had been responsible primarily for leading the revolution months earlier were now seen as enemies of the state because they were barriers to the people that had consolidated power.
Right. Okay. And so he's put into this sent to prison. Is it an internment camp?
No, it's a military prison.
Military prison.
Big walls.
Right.
It's a cold, dark.
Is it like a gulag?
No, it is a prison. Right. But it's a prison as you would imagine an early 20th century prison is.
A tough old place.
A tough old place with big walls, cold stone walls. And he's thrown in the jail. And they have a trial in July the following year. So he's there for 6 months.
Right.
And they have a trial. One of the people he was arrested with becomes a very prolific left-wing propaganda sort of agent. He's a sort of a left-wing Murdoch almost.
An agent provocateur.
But he realizes that media can, like Goebbels did for the Nazis, realizes that you can control the media. If you can control media, you can control the people. Mm-hmm. But he does it from a left-wing perspective. So he spends most of his life essentially requesting blank checks from Moscow to try and sort of brainwash the people. And Anyway, but the
But
genesis...
what's Moscow's skin in this game?
Well, this is later
so that
on.
they can take
later on. But
right.
So this chap, Willy Munzenberg, who becomes a very significant figure later on in the story, he is arrested with Albert along with two others that are also quite significant. And they're all sort of far left wing. So they're all rounded up, arrested. When their trial happens in July, they're seen as the judges are quite sympathetic. You know, they argue quite articulately that they're being arrested for their beliefs rather than for their acts,
Right.
which is a political prisoner then. And the judges sympathise with that and release them.
Wow. And so then he's still, in many people's eyes, going to be an enemy of the state, but he's released. Right.
Yeah, so he ends up back in Stuttgart.
It's a dangerous...
they have to move around a lot. And
right. So he goes back to a place he knows.
He goes back to the place he knows, and that's when he has his first daughter, my grandmother. So he goes back to Stuttgart. He sort of starts writing, because I think sort of, although he's not a trained writer, he does seem to be coveted for his writing.
Right.
Throughout his life. You know, it's something that people sort of call on him for.
So he had an aptitude for it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he had a skill in writing, but also writing, I don't know if it's persuasive text or just articulate text.
It's probably
accessible.
It's probably that he's had a diet of what seems like nothing but left-wing socialist propaganda for the past, how many years are we talking at this point? 5 years?
Yeah,
4 or 5 years?
It's not early. I mean,
well, from 15, so 10 years maybe.
Yeah.
If I'm getting my timeline right.
Yeah, and he sort of ends up writing. So he becomes an editor for a newspaper, sort of left-wing newspaper, but he's also writing in his spare time and not so spare time, as well as having a child in 1920, this is.
And I was going to say, how does he get a job when he's a former enemy of the state, but it's a left-wing paper, so he's probably quite well respected, isn't he? There?
Yeah, and I think sort of one thing you've got to bear in mind in the context as well is that Stuttgart is a very industrial city. So even though that there is a big party line and a centralised line, which is kind of anti the extreme left wing, on the shop floor, i.e. the factory floors, there's still a lot of support for the more extreme left wing politics.
Right.
There's a sense that
that's their only hope, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's also a sense that the revolution promised a lot, and although it got rid of the monarchy, it didn't really it didn't really touch the industrialists, the capitalists that were profiting to the detriment of the working forces and people. So, there was a sense of unfinished business, I think.
And I imagine he's gone away. He's done these things which are still impressive achievements. He's a little more worldly. He's been shot. He probably looks a bit gnarly and tough. He comes back. But if he's in an industrial area, he's probably considered to be quite intelligent. He's probably one of the more intelligent.
And I think I think he bridges
minds.
that as well. He bridges that gap between the intellectuals, the military, and the working.
So the working, because I can't imagine the education system for all the people that are on the factory floor in that era have been through a particularly great education system. So he must be quite impressive at this point.
So the boy that did good, isn't he?
Right, yeah.
Except for the old war thing. But.
Yeah, and I get, but there is some, people who can distill intellectual arguments and ideas and thoughts into a layman.
Yeah.
Often do very, very well.
And I think also, the other thing that's apparent is he's very highly thought of in the party, in the sort of the political circles. So when he goes up to Berlin for the council, he gets to meet Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht as a friend of Clara Zetkin, his old mentor. He gets to meet all these very influential people, the people that really led the revolution and were supposed to be responsible for its aftermath.
Right.
He's seen as a very significant, so when he goes away from Berlin after this meeting, he's sent back to Stuttgart and told that, we need military leaders in all these areas in case it kicks off again.
Right.
We need you to be that one in Stuttgart.
It's interesting that for a man who's been shot and has seen so much atrocity and has been the head of the war minister or head of, what was the term again?
Kriegsminister. The war. Right. Yeah, he's the minister of war.
Minister of war. He still believes in military. It's that is interesting that, He's seen the worst of it. Yeah, he still needs. He still sees its value or its worth.
But I think also you can't. What you have to think of at the time is that, or at this period, there's a massive class system involved in the military.
Right.
So a working class struggle isn't just in the factories; it's in the military.
Right.
And Germany, as well as having had conscription, also, and England the same, had a huge amount of its working class populations sea service at the Western Front and elsewhere. So it's, although I think that they're prepared that there may need to be military action rather than...
So they're covering their asses.
I think they're covering their asses, and also recognising that with having just come out of a war, there are people that know how to do this shit.
Yeah.
And, I think sort of the benefit of, I was saying earlier that he was sort of a non-commissioned officer, is that he straddles then that sort of the strategy side of military and the intellectual side of military, but also ultimately he's a grunt who feeds and fixes machine guns. So he sort of has and has come from the factory floor, so he knows how to speak to the common man or what have you. Sorry, that's how it sounds. I know that sounds really patronising, but essentially that's.
But it's correct though, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And okay, so then what? I guess this is the thread for this podcast.
Yeah,
and then what? And then what happened? And then what did he do?
Then what? Could we have a timeout just for a bit? I need a pee.
Absolutely.
And a cigarette.
Yeah, absolutely. Harry, this is a reference for you. We are in part 2 of
Infinite.
part 2 of Cole Henley's
Ramble chat.
Albert Schreiner.
Schreiner.
Not Schneider, that's Deuce Bigelow, Mel Gigolo.
Yeah. Or Scheider, who is the guy in Jaws, who I always thought was Schreider, but apparently it's Scheider. Roy Scheider. There we go.
I see. Right, so we got to 1920.
1920. So Albert has his first daughter, my grandmother, in 1920.
Yeah.
And he's working a lot in newspapers, but is also still quite a senior political figure in the local sort of far left socialist movement. And he gets sent to Moscow in 1921. So he goes, as a representative of the German socialists, he goes to a congress in Moscow and meets Lenin.
Right.
So it's an international council of the international workers and soldiers councils, which is basically just Russia and Germany. It's seen as an international congress, but it's basically Russian Congress with some Germans there.
Right.
And I found a short article he wrote about. He goes to this meeting and Lenin's there. And Lenin at this point, this is 1921, Lenin had led the revolution 4 years earlier, but he's very ill now. He's struggling with his health a lot. He's had a few strokes, but he's also struggling with the fact that he doesn't know what happens next. And he knows there's going to be a power grab in Russia when he goes. Right.
And just give me a brief refresher on Lenin. I know he is a huge figure in... So Lenin, I don't want to say communism and it be socialism, so put me right here.
In this context, they're kind of the same thing. So Lenin was a massive, not in the sense of a massive socialist, but he was massively involved in the socialist movement, the international socialist movement in the early 20th century. He's in exile from Russia during World War I, large parts of World War I, and returns sort of on the sly. I think he's in Poland, but I'm not sure the specifics.
And why is he exiled?
He's
because he's just too
unfavourable figure. He's radical. He's banging on about dramatic social reform.
Right, and he has enough clout to be seen as an issue.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I think he is very much perceived as a threat.
Right.
To the status quo. Status quo being the monarchy in Russia at the time. So
is that an oligarchy?
No, that's someone that owns football clubs. No, you're not far off.
Right.
It's the same principle, a power grab. A change in power, people fight for the resources or control. And I don't fully know. I know oligarchs own a lot of flats in Camden, and a couple of football clubs. But generally, what happened was the people in military and political power when Russia reformed in 1989, 1990, managed to start to own all of state resources, like gas and oil and mines and stuff. And they used the wealth of that to then... It's called, I say football club because there's a big thing about sports washing or sports cleaning, where essentially you clean money by investing in foreign things. The Middle East countries do it a lot, buying up Man City and the like. And
so they become fronts for...
Yeah, it's not quite money laundering, it's more reputation laundering.
Right.
That they're trying to sort of build up their international image.
Yeah.
Rather than just sitting in gold palaces and, the things that they fought against and then sort of become what they hated, sort of things.
Right.
But yeah, so to go back to Lenin, Lenin was a very dangerous figure perceived. He was writing a lot. I mean, he was a Marxist, so he was writing a lot of interpretations of Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in the sort of mid-19th century, possibly later. I think it was the mid-19th century, along with Engels. So he was writing a lot about a modern interpretation, sort of a late 19th, early 20th century interpretation of communism, and talking about the need for it, but also how it could be realised, and one of which was obviously overthrowing the monarchy. So he was well known and a sort of, as you said earlier, public enemy number one in Russia.
Right.
To the point that in 1917 he comes back to Russia and leads a revolution, and it's quite a bloody revolution. They overthrow the Tsar and their family and seize power with the military. Russia, like all the countries in Europe at this time in the First World War, essentially were economically devastated by the cost of war. It was a war of attrition, not only in destroying landscapes and people, but also just destroying public purse. So there was a huge amount of poverty at home.
Right.
Like if you read about the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution, like the big slogan is peace and bread, because people want peace because they want their soldiers back, but they want bread because they can't eat.
Right.
So, and that becomes the mantra. And Lenin seizes on this a year earlier than they did in Germany, pulls Russia out of the war, overthrows the monarchy, and leads essentially the first communist state. And he's very much, although he's seen as the political figurehead and Trotsky is seen as the military figurehead, they kind of work together. But then what happens is you end up with, when Lenin starts getting ill, this wrestle for power of his legacy. Who's going to control what happens next? And Lenin knows this, and he's terrified. And the one thing that's interesting is when you read about it, is the one thing that he knew is that Stalin would be a terrible leader.
Right. So he's worried, essentially, that he's created something that he unfortunately isn't then able to see through to some sort of permanent or official end.
Yeah.
And he worries that he may have started the downfall, or he may have planted the seeds of something that may, once he's gone, become very ugly and something that he wouldn't want any part of.
Yeah, and I think Lenin, above all, Lenin's an idealist. And so he has an idea about change and is very keen to execute that. But he doesn't really, and he has lots of ideas about what might follow, but he's not very good at thinking through the sort of unknowns. And what, I think, I wouldn't say he's not very good at it, but he just hadn't, I don't think he'd really factored in the realism and actually the day-to-day of how then what happens when you have power.
Right.
And we have to realise these ideas, but also circumnavigate demands and compromises as well, because, good leadership demands compromise.
Right.
Otherwise you become like a dogmatist, which obviously Stalin later became. And he knew that in Stalin. I think that he was very worried about the shift in power after he died.
When he talks about Stalin, he talks about... Is this a man he knows personally, intimately?
Stalin is very senior in the movement.
Right. So he's not some figure that he reads about in leaflets and papers.
There's essentially two camps that are around Lenin. Right. Sort of whispering into his ear and stuff. Trotsky's on one of them, and then there's three guys, I can't remember their names, sorry. There's a triumvirate of people whispering into his other ear.
Right.
And he, on the one hand, I think he sees balance in that because he's getting different opinions. And Lenin is a very intellectual guy. He knows that he needs to understand what's happening on both sides to make a decision.
Right.
But he knows also that in that triumvirate that are on one side, Stalin is the guy that's going to seize power if they get power. And that's going to become just an imbalance. I might be reading into this too much because of what happens afterwards, but there's definitely a sense in when you read about the history at this time that he is concerned about what happens next, and particularly he's concerned about what happens next if Stalin is the one that carries the baton forward.
Right.
So this is 1921. Albert's in Moscow, and he gets to meet Lenin for the first and only time. And he's obviously read all his stuff. He's in awe of this guy. And the first experience he writes about is actually being disappointed.
Right. Never meet your heroes.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Exactly. So he's in a meeting. The meeting's conducted because it's obviously in Russian, so they have an intermediary that communicates his message in German. And he sits there and he's underwhelmed. He's like, where is this great figure? You led a revolution in Russia. That revolution cascaded to us in Germany. We hung on every word of you, and I'm sitting here and I'm expecting genius, and I'm not getting it. And,
do you feel that he's pedestaled him, and he's holding him to a standard that he possibly couldn't live up to, because what Albert is seeing is the cost. What Albert's seeing is the cost of this journey, of this idea, of this dream, of this thing that they're working towards. He's seen the very real. I mean, he's been shot in the jaw himself. How could someone possibly, who's been through what Albert's been through, find what he's looking for in a single human being after what he's been through?
Well, the interesting thing then is so this is a reflection later in his life about this anecdote. The interesting thing is that he comes away disappointed from this meeting. He gets to meet the guy himself, and like you say, you don't meet your heroes. This guy that is on a pedestal for him.
Yeah.
Probably literally as well, there's statues of him everywhere, but he's a guy that he looks up to. He expects every word that comes out of his mouth to be gold dust.
Right.
He goes back to his hotel room, crestfallen, disappointed.
Okay.
And then what they did is because they were very organised, they translated all the meeting notes that were transcribed and then translated into the various languages of the people present. So in his hotel room, he receives the documents that day of the meeting that he was in.
Very efficient.
Very efficient, yeah. And he digests it and realises, and he basically calls himself an idiot. He just like, how stupid was I? I was expecting these words of greatness and they were right in front of me. And the problem he found was that he was confusing. He was expecting him to be very intellectual and use very complex language.
Right.
And what he wasn't expecting was him to communicate very effectively in simple terms.
Right.
So actually what he was saying was like, I can't remember the gist of it, but essentially the punchline to this like anecdote and this memory was that, he learned a lot from that encounter because he was expecting great things. And he kind of got it, but he didn't actually recognise it at the time because he was expecting the greatness to be through the delivery rather than the message. And the message actually was very clear and very simple.
Yeah.
And sort of mentioned about Albert's writing, I think he learned a lot from that because what we find is that his writing becomes treasured in the Socialist Party when he goes back to Germany and I think a big part of that is him learning about how to communicate, how to simplify your message, how to be... It's not dumbing down, but it's about tropes and learning how to communicate in a way that sticks in people's minds.
Yeah, and also finding the broadest audience.
Yeah,
because it's not in his interest to appeal to the intelligentsia? Is it intelligentsia?
Yeah.
Or the really intellectual elites.
Yeah,
because that doesn't.
And there's a big problem in German socialist movement at the time is that it is predominantly led by academics and writers and like you say, the intelligentsia. So These are people that are essentially controlling the message, but also almost incapable of communicating it,
right,
in ways that could be understood by the very people that they're trying to save.
right.
You know, it's sort of almost from a position of privilege that they're trying to have a revolution,
right,
when in fact the people they need to execute that they can't communicate with. So this is why people like Albert become really important.
And do you think Albert is looking for, like I said earlier, about he's seen the cost of these dreams, of these ideas, and trying to get somewhere. Do you think he's also looking within Stalin to hear something which Lenin, which tells him that everything he's done was worth it?
Yeah, I think so. I think
validates his.
I think, like, also, like, you know, with any revolution, a revolution is not about. A revolution obviously is about change, but it's only ever a start. And so you can have lots of great ideas and you can execute to a point, but there's always going to be an unknown if it works, you know. And I think sort of that's the real challenge. I think there's a degree that Albert would have wanted to know not only what had happened in Russia, because they had a 1-year head start, but also what their plans were going forward. Because, you know, there's an idea which is fundamental and dramatic change, but then there's the execution of that idea once it's happened. Is that, you know, like, you've got to marry up local politics with factories, with keeping the churches happy, keeping the factory owners happy, but also the factory workers happy, with education and healthcare and things like that. You know, you
have to please everyone, and you can't do that.
Everyone, and also, you know, if your starting point is an ideology that is about economic disparity, but you're massively dependent on the wealthiest for the taxes that are going to help you realize this idea, you've got to be, you know, that's a real eye-opener, what happens when you get into that position. And particularly, I mean, because politics corrupt people, and, you know, you are having to talk to people that don't want change because they've made their life and their livelihood out of the status quo. And they're still in positions of power, as most of the people in government were at that time. And
they maybe have no vested interest in that changing. They've essentially become career politicians at this point, right?
Yeah.
So they're only looking out for their own...
You definitely see this with the Socialist Party in Berlin, where there's people that are sort of not wanted revolution, benefited a lot from it, claimed the victory afterwards, and then not really want to do a lot with it once they've got it.
Right. So it was more about... Well, do you think those are people that are perhaps seeking some sort of glory or to become folklore heroes?
There's a massive part of ego in there.
Right.
And there's also, it's a power thing. It's a bunch of guys, and they are always guys, who want the power and the control. And once they get it, they don't want to let go of it.
Power corrupts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so he's had an audience, I guess, with not Stalin, Lenin.
The other one.
And as
which
you said,
is a good one, but maybe the less bad one.
He goes away to his hotel. He receives these transcripts. He digests them. He has his epiphany.
Yeah. And I think he comes back to Germany re-energized. And also he's established connections in Moscow. So Moscow recognised that at this point there's a communist party that's formed in Germany, which is primarily the independent socialists that were established before, and the Spartacus League merged to form the Communist Party. There's still some sort of people that are in both, and some in one and not the other and stuff, but generally the Communist Party forms in Germany.
Right.
And that's ideologically aligned with the Communist Party in Russia.
Right.
To the point that
the enemy of my enemy is my... No, that's not right. That's not
I think it's sort of having it's like a distant cousin, but lots of distance. You know, and also it's having a distant cousin that has all the best toys. So you're expecting the hand-me-down PlayStations and the skateboards that they grow out of, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Gross oversimplification, but hopefully you get the metaphor.
Yeah, and so he's come back.
He's come back re-energized.
He's got a bit more clout, and he's probably feeling validated in what he's setting out to do, and he's probably feeling confident and backed, and
solidarity.
Yeah,
like there's a solidarity. He's found people. Although he'd had them in Germany, he's found almost a nation of them that actually share his beliefs and ideals.
Right.
And I don't think he's stupid. I think he recognises that there are problems, with how Russia's executed this idea. But essentially, like you said, my enemy's enemy is my friend, But more than that, it's a sort of people that I'm ideologically aligned with where, I'm disagreeing on certain things, but ultimately I want them in my corner.
Right, yeah. And then what? What year are we in now?
This is 1921. So 1921, he becomes an editor and he moves to, I think, the Ruhr. So the Ruhr is a western border of Germany that borders with France. Now, the Ruhr has always been a bit of a political hotspot.
Right. Is this because it's so close to France?
Partly, yeah. Partly because it's very rich in minerals and timber. So it becomes this sort of land grab for resources, coal, I think, in particular. So it becomes this context where there's people trying to control the resources in the area. Now, I'm going to say, I've said this a lot already, and I'm going to say it a lot again. For the purpose of context, at the end of World War I, Germany lost. Germany lost World War I. It had to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially conceded responsibility. So even though it hadn't started the war, Austro-Hungary had.
Right. They said, look, you've lost. Now you have to say it was our fault.
It was, yeah.
Take the heat, take the rap.
You turned it up to 11. You take the rap for it.
Okay.
And which they kind of did.
Yeah.
And so, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to concede to a number of things. One of which was the dissolution of its army, which, as a proudly military nation, was a big ego.
Yeah, that's what's the word for that? They've been neutered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good word. So they've been neutered by this, but also one of the things is they had to pay. So they had to pay financially, like the other countries that have won. So France, England, everyone, but particularly the countries that they had attacked.
This is fucking mean. This is domination.
Yeah,
isn't it?
It's humbling.
Yeah,
it's a massive humbling.
It's they're getting a spanking for this, aren't they?
And it's a massive economic spanking as well, because what happens ultimately by 1921 is Germany can't afford to pay. Because as well as having to deal with the economic cost of having fought a war that they lost, which they got massively into debt doing. They're now having to pay what money they don't have to the countries that won.
Right.
And what happens is that I think it's 1921, they basically they default. They miss a few payments.
Right.
And part of this is due to political struggles in Berlin that they can't quite...
Is there cash being withheld?
There's cash withheld, but there's also a lot of political conflict on who controls that cash and where it goes.
Right, okay.
And there's basically what happens is France gets pissed off, it doesn't get its money, it takes part of Germany. So it invades Germany, basically. Just
annexes a part of it.
It just annexes the Ruhr. The soldiers come in,
right,
start taking out the coal.
They go, right, we're going to have this coal. This will pay you off.
Yeah, so they're expecting payment in kind. Now, unfortunately, the Ruhr is one of these hotbeds of the socialist movement. It's one of these very red centres, along with Stuttgart and
red meaning
Leipzig, like very very left wing.
Right.
So you've got like Berlin, Leipzig, Chemnitz, Stuttgart, the Ruhr, Hamburg. These are all like very strong left wing centres, mostly because they're very industrial.
Right.
And what happens is like just the workers get pissed off, so they start having their own little revolution, and so you've got like the Germans fighting the French. Albert's an editor at this point, and he's just like, yeah, I'm just going to just talk about this and publish it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So he's there for a while. It's quashed, and I might be getting my years mixed up. Apologies, but essentially what happens is that the German government send in the German army, which are mostly right wing, pissed off people that they lost the war, and they basically massacre hundreds of these socialist workers who still have got rifles and stuff. And it becomes a real like bloodbath, but also a really like symbolic moment in the struggle for who owned the left-wing revolution in Germany. So Albert's writing a lot about this, and there's a sense that another revolution's coming. And also the difference now is that Russia wants to control it. Russia wants to have people on the ground inform and determine and dictate the German revolution. And the Germans that are up for revolution need Russia because they're the ones that are going to be bringing in the weaponry and the finances to help fund that. So Albert gets involved then with he gets sent to Moscow again, but this time it's sent to a military school to prepare for revolution.
Right.
So he becomes this sort of essentially this military leader that's there to get trained to then become an insurgent in his own country. So he does that in 1923. So
this means he's we would call that an extremist, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
A radical. Has he been radicalized?
Radicalized, like by Ben Kenobi.
Right. So is this akin to someone flying out to Afghanistan to an ISIS camp?
I'm not sure if it is, because I mean, it's his own country.
Right.
You know, like he's not going to fight another war. It's his war.
Right.
I mean, and he personally, you know, he fought for his country. He worked hard, extremely hard. And not forgetting, throughout this period, he goes back to prison several times. He goes on hunger strike for 6 weeks or something because he's constantly being imprisoned for his beliefs. And he keeps arguing this, like, you're imprisoning me because of my beliefs, not because of my actions. And every time he's released, but then he gets him back again.
So this is why this has happened.
Well, he's pissed off.
Yeah, well, he's been ground down and victimised by the powers that be.
And he sees the impotence of the powers that be, you know, like
and this just hardens his resolve.
Yeah.
So like he keeps getting put in fucking prison for what he believes in. And this is, we'll see this in history and other people, is that when they finally become these like, they've got, you know, when they've become radicalized or whatever, they've committed to properly fighting, there's probably always a theme of, you know, them being suppressed in some way.
A bit tangent, but I studied history at GCSE, and I was very fortunate. I went to a Catholic school in the middle of England that studied the Irish problem, the Irish Troubles, but from an Irish perspective. And this was in an English curriculum, but the curriculum was just like, let's do the Irish Troubles. Yeah. But because it was a Catholic school, it was like, let's look at it from the Irish perspective. It absolutely blew my mind. Right. Because bearing in mind at this time, the Troubles were still happening. You know, the Good Friday Agreement was 6 years away. Right. I mean, that's but that touches into your point. You know, like, this is someone that's been ground down, and everyone that believes what he believes in are being persecuted for their beliefs. Right. And it's doubly galling, like I said, because the people in power got into power because of the actions of him and his friends and his colleagues. And so, you know, as I started this conversation, he's a patriot. He wants a better Germany, but he knows that they're not getting it at the moment. And he's seeing political abuse. Like, you know, like,
right. So there's two ways these people go, isn't it? You either get broken, which is what they want. They want to break your will, make you and make you submit, or you go the other way. You become hardened. You become callous. Yeah. And he's gone that way. He's gone callous, hasn't he?
I think what happens during this time as well is because he's had 2 daughters. So I think there's a degree of wanting, I think they are quite influential, because then suddenly it becomes not just an idea, it becomes about a future.
Right. That's an interesting aspect as well, because that could be what breaks him, because he could think, I need to be around for these daughters, I need to safeguard them in the future, blah blah blah.
But on the flip side, from a personal and family point of view, actually, he spends a lot of the time in his daughter's upbringing in prison, going off fighting wars. You know, like, so it's got, and I don't know if this is a generational thing, but, you know, his ideology, I think, is purely, I need to get the best future for my children. Right. But it's also by not being here, by fighting, by fighting this cause for them, you know. And I can recognise that, you know, like, I went into, when I had a child, our first child, I kind of went into a bit of caveman mode. You know, my job is to provide. I must go out and earn money. Yeah. And there's like, it seems like a contradiction that you want to do the best for your children by not being there, but actually what you're trying to do is provide as comfortable an environment for them as possible.
Yeah, and I totally know what you mean. Not that I've been there. Yeah,
but I can guarantee that Emma and the 2 daughters, Sonia and Helga, didn't have a very comfortable upbringing. They were moving around a lot. They had the police kicking down the doors a lot. Is there
evidence in their writings or any correspondence that they're like sick of it? Oh God, I wish Dad would just.
Well, they were quite young, and I think by the time they left Germany, I mean, they left Germany when they were early teenage. So, and also, like I said earlier, like the thing that Germany is a very patriarchal society. So, children have their place.
Right.
I think there's like a very strong disciplined view in, and it sounds like a gross generalization, but I've had my.
So they're like, do not question your father.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Certainly, either at this time or certainly in this family, father's doing what father's doing.
Right.
And it was influential. My gran went on to be a Labour councillor for like 40 years. So, obviously it stuck.
Yeah, there's an influence there. And so, so where are we now?
We are in 1922, coming on to 1923. So 1923 is interesting because what happens is, because of his communication with Moscow, there's a decision made in Moscow that there is going to be a revolution in Germany. They're basically telling Germany that they are going to have a revolution, and they're helping them. They're sending rifles over and stuff like that, and they're providing a lot of the intelligence and the groundwork and the communication to make this happen.
Right.
And so centres are placed around Germany, little cells. So to use your analogy earlier, so little cells are set up around Germany, ready for this to happen.
Right.
And Albert's in Hamburg. Hamburg's one of these very staunch left-wing areas, particularly because it's got docks. There's a big socialist workers sort of movement around all the shipping and stuff like that. So he's sent there there's an area called the Wasserkant, the water side, basically, I think. So he's sent there as essentially a military leader for the revolution that's yet to happen.
Right.
What follows is really interesting. So essentially, they are on the cusp of revolution. They decided a day, they've decided a moment. They're waiting for that signal, and then it triggers too early. There's something happens, I think, in in one of the Bavarian countries, and it's like not really related to this, but it seizes the government's attention, and they're like, "Oh shit!" If we do it now, it's not the right time. Something's happened. We need to stop. Put the brakes on.
Right.
So memos are sent out, and they get to everywhere but Hamburg. And for some reason, Hamburg doesn't get the memo. So the day and the moment that they're supposed to revolt,
doesn't get the memo.
Literally doesn't get the memo.
Right.
So they actually have a revolution without realising the rest of the country isn't following suit.
Shit.
And the two leaders of that are Albert and Ernst Thälmann, who later becomes a very senior political figure in the Communist Party in Germany.
Is that potential sabotage there? Is there a conspiracy?
I think, I don't know.
Or just that it's fucking chaos and it's clandestine.
I don't know. I think there's just the potential that it didn't get through. I think there's the potential that the person responsible for getting that message through just didn't. I don't know why it. Essentially, what happened was it was called off at the last minute. Hamburg is the one place that it didn't get called off.
So they don't. Yeah. So it's like
Hamburg's the one place that Albert is.
Right. Okay.
And it happens. So they have a revolution, and they get basically after about 3 or 4 days, it's suppressed.
Right.
Because it's not happening around the rest of the country, and they just realise that they're fighting a losing battle.
Right.
At this point, he goes into hiding.
And what kind of role is he going to have in this revolution?
He's a military leader, so he's been trained at military schools in Russia.
Right. So he's going to be involved with some very violent decisions.
Yeah, and it's not there are casualties. It's not a massively bloody revolution. It's mostly like seizing the police stations and controlling the telephone lines sort of thing. And they do that quite easily because the police, whilst armed, aren't interested in armed battles. Right. They as soon as they've got like 3 guys with guns turned up, they're like, yeah, right, yeah, you want the key?
Yeah.
And it's not a massively bloody revolution, but what it does is it becomes urban warfare, essentially. What happens is that there's a very socialist area in Hamburg, and there's some very iconic pictures, because it's cobbled streets, they ended up building all these like barriers with the cobbles from the streets. And it's very iconic. I mean, although they lost, it became a very iconic event in German socialist history, particularly in East Germany. There's a lot of reference back to it as a sort of not a missed opportunity, but almost like, the sort of thing people write songs about and sing about. Right.
It becomes a folklore thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So he's telling his men, stand down. They've blown their load too early.
Yeah.
Right. I didn't want to really use that analogy, but there you go. They've premature. and now they've almost been caught with their pants
They turned
down.
up to an orgy and realised it was a one-man. Yeah. They basically have to, because he's a wanted man now, because he has led a revolution and it's failed. So he's a wanted man.
He's a domestic terrorist.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
So I think this is when they end up in Berlin.
Right.
So
is that because it's close to a border, or is it because Berlin will have a stronger?
Berlin's always been seen as Red Berlin, like it's the place where all the socialists are.
Right.
Certainly not the more the intellectual socialists than the sort of the factory floor socialists, but
right.
it's basically
because it's a city,
and it's also the capital of Germany. So it's like definitely the sort of the centre of politics, but also the centre of this sort of ideo-political movement.
The intelligentsia.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so he gets to, somehow, that could have been an epic journey in itself, couldn't it? He gets to Berlin on the run, where he finds refuge with his cohorts, I guess.
Comrades.
Or people who are sympathetic to his cause. Where do we go then? Where are we now? 1923, 4?
Yeah, 23, 24. So, like I said earlier, he was co-leading the uprising in Hamburg with Ernst Thälmann.
Right.
Ernst Thälmann becomes quite a senior political figure in the Communist Party in Berlin. What you cannot do, and we've not really touched on this yet, is you cannot divorce what's happening with the left wing in Germany at this time with what's happening with the right wing.
Right.
So at the same time that Hamburg's having an uprising on the left, Hitler is trying to sort of start an uprising on the right down in Bavaria, which is the more sort of right-wing part of Germany.
Bavaria is also quite a wealthy part of Germany, isn't it? Is that right?
I don't really know a great deal about Bavaria, except they have really good beer.
Yeah. And a beautiful landscape.
And a beautiful landscape, yeah.
Yeah.
The hills are alive. Oh, that's Austria, isn't it? So Thälmann becomes this almost... Because of this failed uprising, Thälmann, who's, I would say... He's a very charismatic guy, but he's a guy that wants to be at the top. Not like a Boris Johnson aspirational leader. He wants to be a figurehead and lead and drive things forward.
Right.
So he, like Lenin was, is an idealist, and he's wanting to push the movement forward. At the same time, Hitler's trying to do the same with the right-wing movement and recognizing that he has a lot of support in Bavaria. He has a lot of Christian, traditional, pissed off Germans that lost the war and pissed off that they lost the monarchy and, very patriotic, but like nationalist rather than patriotist sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he's getting a massive audience down there. But he knows full well that he can't get any momentum without seizing the sort of political landscape in Berlin. So it's around this time that he sends Goebbels up. Goebbels is sort of his media man. He's the Dominic Cummings sort of thing. He's the man that controls the image and the message.
Yeah.
So Goebbels gets sent up to Berlin purely because he knows he calls it the Red City, that he needs to sort of get a stranglehold here if they've got any chance of political success. So the next few years, what unfolds is basically this wrestle for power between the communists and the right wing, they weren't. I can't remember what they were called before they were the Nazis, or i.e. the National Socialist Party. They were something else, and I can't remember the name of them. But there was this. It became these.
So they had to rebrand a few times till they got it. I don't want to say they got it right, but they did get it. They got it right.
Well, no, it was all about the message. And for example, the Nazi is like a sort of a shortening of Nationalsozialismus, which is just National Socialists. And that message was introduced purely to appeal to the socialists, the disenfranchised socialists.
Right.
The Nazis were never a socialist party, but they knew that if they could control the message, that they would sign up a lot of socialists.
Right.
It's smoke and mirrors.
So cunning.
Yeah. Fake news, man. But so Goebbels is sent up basically to stir up a hornet's nest, and he's basically set up with a load of bother boys. So what happens is they identified all the places that the communists are having meetings, and then they go and have they basically just turn up with loads of they weren't really fascists at this time, but loads of people that don't like communists, and start fighting them. They literally just have barroom brawls, and to try and just sow dissent and disarray. and it really because there's no doubting as well that Hitler was threatened by the communists. He thought they genuinely presented a threat to what his aspirations were.
Right.
And so he knew that there had to be like a in the pubs battlefield where we sort of sow dissent and try and disrupt them.
Right.
But what you ended up with is this escalation between the left and the right. So in the landscape of what was, I mean, there's a broader political and economic story here where essentially Germany's economically shafted. We've had the Great Depression coming through the 20s and into the 30s. And that's just, that happened to all countries around the world. It's the ripples of the First World War. But in Germany, because of the reparations, it's amplified massively. And you see these pictures they're using like 1,000-mark notes for like wallpaper and between two slices of Warburton sort of thing, just to keep the kids' tummies full. And so you get this. So there's a broader economic tension, and every time you get these sort of this amplification of left and right wing, it's always down to economic problem. People are looking for a solution because there's a problem, and that problem is usually economics.
Right.
And this is what happens in Germany. It is the case book of what happens.
Right.
And so you get the people moving to the left, the people moving to the right. Those two clash. What you end up starting is that they don't become just political parties, that you get military wings, paramilitary wings of these parties. So the Germans had the Sturmabteilung, which is the SA, which is sort of used to be the military leaders and then got basically massacred when Hitler got power. In the Night of the Long Daggers or something like that.
Oh, is this when they I know what you're saying.
They basically overnight murdered.
Yeah, and they set fire to the Reichstag. Is that right?
No. I'll come on to that. That's when Hitler seizes power in 1933. But essentially, after seizing power, all the people that had helped him get into power in the Sturmabteilung, which were essentially the stormtroopers of the Nazi Party, the paramilitary front of the Nazi political party. Right. A lot of those were massacred in a seize of power. Right. By Hermann Goering and Goebbels and Hitler and stuff. But yeah, so what you end up with these two extreme parties, and each party starts to get this paramilitary wing, which is partly about confrontation, like starting fights, but it's also about protecting them. So you would have marches, and if there was a communist march in Berlin, they knew they would get attacked by National Socialists. So they start to have these paramilitary parties purely to protect them. Right. But then what ended up happening is the paramilitary parties became almost the thing that people were signing up to. Right. And so you start to see this sort of, what's the word? This tokenization of military. It becomes this very symbolic thing that you get people marching around Berlin armed in military uniform, and each of them have their own uniforms. And there's a book there on the Rote Front Kampfverbund, which is the Red Front. So Albert becomes the military leader of the Red Front, which, along with Ernst Thälmann and Willy Liao, become like that military front of the socialist movement in Berlin, which essentially, if you're a military leader in Berlin, you're the military leader of Germany. Right. The Rote Front Kampfverbund, or RFB, is very interesting because that is the origin of the fist salute that, it cascades through the Spanish Civil War and now into, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Panthers. So this symbol of the raised fist starts in Berlin in 1924. With your great-grandfather? Well, I don't think he started it, but he's part of this movement. You say he's the head? You say he's the head of this thing at the time? He's the military leader. So here's a book from Berlin on the history of the Rote Front Kampfverbund from 1924 to 1929. Right. And it's a funny book because there's a section on musical instruments of the Socialist Party from 1924 to 1929. Would you not agree that's a nice horn? It is a lovely horn. Yeah, very good, yeah. But you've also got some really interesting photographs from the time. So there's pictures of the military uniform and the symbols that they use. So we start to see the raised fist becoming a real left-wing symbol. Excellent. And this is where it starts. But we also start to see some interesting photography. And like I said earlier, when you get these extreme political moments in history, the control of the media becomes all important. And this is the first big political movement that has seized photography as a way of spreading that message. Right. So both on left and right wing, we start to see a massive control of the use of photography.
So it's trailblazers.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also about, you start to actually see doctoring of photographs. So you start to see people being able to control the consumption of, and assuming it's real, and actually it's not.
Right.
And that's something that Stalin did to perfection later in life, when he would literally erase people that he'd erased physically from historic photographs.
Right.
So I've got a photo here, and in fact I might have a larger version somewhere here, but let me just read that. So what we're seeing here is a march in Berlin. Now this is in 1927, and we're seeing a march of hundreds of thousands of people supporting this movement. I'm not exaggerating. Hundreds of thousands of people. We've all seen the Nazi sort of Nuremberg rallies, but the left were doing very similar things.
This looks like the shot when the president is sworn in.
Yeah,
this looks very much
the one where not Trump's one.
Not Trump's one, where there was more people showed up than ever before. No, but this is very reminiscent. There's flag bearers here.
It's all about symbolism.
Yeah. This is more of a show of power, isn't it?
And here, at the very front of this column, because it is a military column, we have three people. We have Willy Loehr, who's the secretary, Ernst Thälmann, who's the sort of token leader, and Albert, who is the military
So
leader.
here's your great-grandfather.
Yeah, so he's the front. He is in the top hierarchy of this huge paramilitary organization.
Badass.
In Berlin. And so there's lots of fighting in Berlin. And actually what we find is that the arrival of the Nazis kind of almost causes a consolidation of the left.
Right.
That, realizing, as you said earlier, my enemy's enemy is my friend. We see a lot of people move towards the Communist Party in Berlin. Admittedly, it's like saying that we can't extrapolate what happens in London from the rest of the country.
Right.
So this is just Berlin. This isn't really telling us what's happening in the rest of the country, but it becomes a fulcrum and a real hot spot for this tension and this conflict.
Right.
And kind of this ownership of the future, because unfortunately, after the revolution in 1918, it's not that the revolution didn't work, but it never got a chance to work out what it was going to do next, partly because of external factors like the war credits and stuff. So there's essentially this huge political vacuum waiting to be filled.
Right.
And as we are seeing...
And they're aware of this? Are they aware of this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense that there is an opportunity and that Germany's at a fork in the road. It's going to go in one direction. It's not going to go down the middle anymore.
Okay.
It's not going to go down like it is basically going to go to one extreme or the other.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, there is, as we've said, with all left-wing organisations, lots of infighting. So although there's a lot of draw of power towards the communist movement from the other socialist and trade union parties in Berlin, what ultimately ends up happening, though, is there's a lot of corruption.
Right.
And from what I can gather, and I don't know if this is me sort of trying to put my great-grandfather in a positive light, but he falls out with the party leaders because there is corruption going on, and he tries to raise it, and he's basically told to leave or suck it up.
Right.
And so he leaves. And this is around 1927.
Of course he's going to leave. He's done multiple prison spells of them trying to...
Well, I don't know, right? So, okay, so...
He just seems like a man of principle.
Yes, but this is a very grey area.
Right.
And so what happens next is, because not only this instance, but there's a broader issue of corruption in the Communist Party. By now, Ernst Thälmann is the leader of the Communist Party, and his secretary embezzles money out of the party, and he tries to cover up for him. So not only is there an instance of corruption within the paramilitary wing of the political party, but the political party itself is sort of in a bit of disarray.
Right.
And there's a general sense as well that with the rise of the Nazi party, that this isn't just about a left-right struggle. This is about what happens in Germany. So there's a sense within a lot of the socialists in Germany that Russia is trying to be a puppet master. And in the sort of kowtowing to Russia, they're actually losing sight of what's happening on the ground, and particularly around anti-Semitism. And that becomes a real problem because the massive economic repercussions of World War I and the Depression are, as we always see, an economic downturn starts to cause, everyone looks to blame someone. Right. And in Germany, it becomes the Jews. And that's something that Goebbels and Hitler really, I don't think it's an opportunist thing. You can see in his early writings that Hitler had a massive dislike for Jews. But you start to see them using that as weaponizing that, starting to use that
within
as
their propaganda.
Exactly. Right. And starting to say, well, if you're looking for someone to blame for this, then you look no further than these people.
Right. This is when we started seeing the propaganda. It was becoming caricatures, wasn't it? They were starting to stereotype the Jews.
Very much so. So, and there was a lot of, print and photography and media that was about controlling a narrative and using very specific and exaggerated characters to try and sort of support the message. And the message was essentially that, we're not the problem. Here's a problem. It's external to us. Let us help control that.
Yeah.
And so you get, at this point, you get a rise in right-wing ideas, a large part of that right-wing ideology revolving around anti-Semitism. But on the left, what you end up with is this sort of fraction with some people feeling like we need Russia and some people feeling like, actually, no, we're missing, Germany is losing its soul here, like a bit. It sounds a bit pretentious, but essentially it is people that were involved in the struggle from the start and said, like, we're so obsessed with the battle, we've forgotten what we're fighting for, sort of thing.
Right.
So a couple of guys that Albert used to know from Stuttgart, I can't remember their names, Brandler and Thalheimer, I think. They set up this opposition party called the KPDO, so the Communist Opposition Party. So it's basically a communist party for communists, but not the Communist Party.
Right.
It's just like,
it's the alternative independence again, isn't
exactly,
it?
Yeah. The People's Front of Judea.
Yeah.
But essentially they were saying, like, we kind of align with the Communist Party. We kind of got the same goals. But however, this isn't an international struggle. This is a German struggle, and we need to focus on some of the problems on the ground.
So it's a nationalist movement.
I wouldn't say a nationalist. I think sort of it's nationally focused. Nationalism. I wouldn't say it's nationalist because nationalism is a very loaded term.
Right.
Nationalism implies insularity and inward looking, and I would say actually the socialists that have a national outlook are very outward looking. They're looking to international cooperation and stuff.
Okay.
But they're certainly in this context they're recognizing that it's not there are struggles that aren't global that have to be addressed, and the main one is the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
And I think they're considerably worried that unless they try and stem Hitler and Goebbels and the messages that they're delivering, they're going to lose. They're going to not only lose power, they're going to lose Germany.
Right.
And so what happens in 1927, I think, 26 or 27, this party's formed and Albert joins up. Now, there's two conflicting views of this, and I have never got to the bottom of it, and I don't know how I'm ever going to. One of which is that Albert, out of principle, stormed out of the Communist Party and aligned with people that he had been involved in the revolution in Stuttgart with.
Right.
Particularly Brandler. He went to prison with Brandler in 1919.
Oh, so they are tight.
They have history.
Yeah.
So that's one view, and that's the sort of message that comes across when he talks about this period in his history, is that he basically saw corruption, he saw an opportunity, and he also was frustrated with the lack of tackling a very genuine problem, which is anti-Semitism, and he moved to this other party. So that's one I quite like. That sounds like a good guy.
Yeah.
The other sort of narrative is that, and this comes from archives in Moscow, is that he was an infiltrator. He was basically signed up to infiltrate this other communist party and keep an eye on them.
Oh, so he's a mole now.
Yeah. Well, we don't know.
Right.
And the thing is, so there are archives in Russia that mention this, and German historians have proposed this, but then I've also spoken to German historians that discredit that.
Right. Why would they? What's the discredit there?
Well, the discredit is because anything in the Russian archives is very politically controlled.
Right.
So there is a narrative behind everything that's written in there.
I see.
So so they're either saving face, because he left the party.
Was it don't let the truth get in the way of a good story?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, so I don't know. And like, you know, I think I said to you before, you know, I'm an invested observer, but I'm trying to be an observer. I'm trying to look at it objectively. I'm trying to try and understand this, mostly from the human story, partly from the family story, but also even from a historical point of view. I'm trying not to let my personal feelings cloud what happens.
Yeah.
But this is definitely a period in time which ultimately we will never know. There are two conflicting records that say what happened at this moment in time. So when it comes to telling this story, you know, I have a gut feeling, but I know that gut feeling is clouded by my own personal
bias.
Yeah. I know that. Yeah.
What's your gut feeling?
I think my gut feeling is he wasn't a mole.
Really? Because my feeling is if I was going to send a mole into somewhere, I'm going to take the guy who's like Albert, who's been to prison multiple times and not broken for his principles, been shot, can talk his way out of multiple political situations, isn't unfamiliar with violence. I don't know. He just seems like the perfect fucking dude.
There's definitely a case that, like, so one of the arguments, apart from personal investment in him not being a mole, is during his time in this sort of opposition party, he writes a lot for them. He becomes the editor of their newspaper, Gegen Denstrom. So he writes a lot for them. He becomes an editor. He writes a lot of articles. And the articles are very... I mean, I've only briefly been able to translate into German, but, you know, they are very... Some of the earliest writings about the dangers of anti-Semitism in Germany with the Nazi Party. You know, and there is the potential that he's gone to a party that he likes, but he is working for someone else. You know, I think partly also with writing and telling this narrative, I'm just worried about it being too complicated. Right. As if it's not already.
Yeah.
And there are definitely arguments about why he probably was a mole. So he leaves the party, he has to leave Germany, he ends up sort of ousted from the party, and then the party, by the party I mean the Russian Communist Party, who are notoriously bad at forgiving and quite brutal with people that turn their back on them, he's then allowed in at a later date. So that's the one argument I think that suggests that he is not. It's not quite as clear cut what's going on. But he's right.
Ambiguous.
It's quite ambiguous. And during this time in the KPDO, Kommunistisch Deutsche Partei Opposition (brackets),
right?
He is very prolific and he writes a lot. He edits, like I said, their newspaper. And ultimately, though, it's kind of futile because what we happened in 1933 is the Reichstag fire. So this is what you were mentioning earlier. What happens is, and no one still knows for certain what happened. The Nazi story is a grumpy communist sets fire to the Reichstag building.
Weak.
And there are articles from the day about, and there was a big thing with Gustav Regler and Willy Munzenberg, who I mentioned earlier, wrote this book explaining how that was impossible, or how there was corridors of power between the Nazis' stronghold and the Reichstag, that they could have sort of set off incendiaries and stuff like that. So it was a political show, likely, but the ultimate gist of it was that Hitler, so at this point, a bit of context again. Hitler was now Chancellor of Germany. There'd been an election, but he got a political minority. So he was sort of a figurehead of a government that he was in the minority of.
Right.
And it was a deal he did with, what was his face? Bismarck. So Bismarck had become like this figurehead of...
Isn't the Bismarck
a ship? Yeah.
A ship now? Is that named after him?
But it was named after... He was the sort of leader of the army in the First World War, and he became this sort of political, this sort of reluctant but sort of old political figure, mostly symbolic after World War One. And he basically conceded some power to Hitler. And what happened was basically when the Reichstag fire happened, Hitler explained that there needed to be a consolidation of power, that he was a bit of a, his hands were tied just being chancellor, and that he was able to basically fudge an election so that you weren't allowed to vote for anyone else, or certainly weren't allowed to vote for the communists. It was that's a gross oversimplification, but the bottom line was he seized power, and overnight, all the communists had to leave Germany.
Right.
So this is 1933. So it was literally the second he seized power, he was knocking on the doors of people he saw as enemy of the states and rounded them up.
Right.
So there was a lot of shit, we've got to get out of here. And a lot of the communists did. I mean, so Albert left, was it like April, I think, 1933, to Paris. The family stayed behind because they're kind of safe. They're not as seen as like a threat. So they're kind of safe for the time being, but they later follow. And Albert he teams up again with Willy Munzenberg, who I just mentioned, who was the guy he was arrested with in 1918.
Right.
And they write together. And Munzenberg is this guy that is just getting bankrolled from Moscow to spread the communist message. And he puts it all into challenging the Nazis. So he writes books, and I've got some here. So these are books that were published. These are reprints, but these were books that were published by Albert. Well, written by Albert, then published by Willy Munzenberg whilst he was in Paris.
Now, I don't really read German.
Oh,
this says Hitler's at the bottom, right?
Well, they were published, I haven't got a copy. They were published in England and, English and French as well. So we've got von totalen Krieg zur totalen Niederlage Hitlers. So it's basically just saying Hitler's preparing for total war. Hitler treibt zum Krieg. These are all basically saying...
These are warnings.
These are warnings. This is 1933, so this is 6 years before World War II.
Yeah.
And he is telling the world...
Yeah.
I know what Hitler's up to.
Yeah.
And it's also that because of Albert's connections with the socialist movement and that socialist movement being situated in factories, he knows what's going on. He knows that they are massive, even though Germany at this time isn't still allowed to have a military presence or an army or a navy or an air force. He knows that they are, a lot of the sort of factories are starting to build armaments. A lot of the, he knows that although there's widespread infrastructure projects to build autobahns, he knows that that's for mobilizing troops. It's not to make it sort of easier for cars to get across Germany. Right.
This is for traversing the Germany quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
And en masse.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, this is one of the few times I find Albert mentioned, certainly in English language historical stuff, is a sense of alarm in some of how much he got, like how much he knew. There was obviously people on the ground in Germany whilst he was in Paris sending, not just information, but like data. What is the production capacity of this factory on this
day?
Okay, what is the land, and there are, I won't trawl through those books now, but there are pictures of factories and things like that, and exactly what they're producing, when and where. So this is,
and he'll know what sort of quantities and the time frame that they can produce these quantities.
So, and he's suggesting in these books that this is Hitler preparing for global domination.
This is mind blowing. Your great grandfather is blowing the whistle on Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, 6 years before World War II.
6 years. In multiple volumes.
Yeah, and these
published
in multiple languages. Yeah.
No one's talking about these.
No.
Why are they?
I don't know if no one knows, or I don't know if anyone.
Do you mean? Well, someone knows. Someone had to translate it. 4 or 5 times.
And I think, like I said earlier, if you go into any Waterstones, you'll get 95 books in German history on the Nazis and 5 books on the other periods of human history. Yeah. Unfortunately, people find the Nazis more interesting, but also, part of the story I'm trying to tell is that people saw this coming, people knew about it, and people were ignored.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time the narrative is that suddenly, oh my God, what is Germany doing? Oh shit!
Oh, they're in Poland.
But it's not. Yeah. We had who was our prime minister at the time?
Chamberlain.
He went over and had meetings with Hitler, didn't he? They were almost seen as really. He had nice things to say about him when he came back, I think.
Yeah, I think I don't think they were necessarily ideologically aligned, but there was definitely a sense that I mean, for all his flaws, of which there are many, Hitler was a very charismatic and persuasive person. He wouldn't have got into the position he did without being.
I just thought that is mind-blowing. That sat in front of me are 2 volumes of books from 6 years prior to World War II, from your great-grandfather and his friend Willy?
Willy Munzenberg.
Willy Munzenberg.
Munzenberg.
Whistleblowing.
Yeah. But
they're on the right side of history.
I think, yeah, exactly. But you've got to recognise that there's an element that they were part of a broader organisation that was the wrong side of history. But also you've got to recognise that no one listened because everyone had their own problems. The whole globe was in a recession.
Yeah, and that is the thing. I can't remember what the term for it is that, but we've talked about this before in council meetings and things like that, is that, you know, people aren't going to care about climate change and the existential threats if
they can't feed their kids.
If they can't feed their kids, if they're the majority, 80% of their existence is figuring out how they're going to keep the roof over their head. Yeah. They're not thinking about recycling plastic. They're not thinking about anything ecological.
Yeah.
Because it becomes their first priority. So that makes complete sense.
On a global scale, you have to be a person in a position of immense privilege to care about the planet. Yeah. It's the bottom line. You know, ideologically, we could all care about it, but, you know, there has to be not just a sustenance, but a buffer to be able to afford to think about the bigger picture.
Right, absolutely.
And the context of that is that, you know, you can write all you like about the threat of Hitler, but if no one reads it and no one cares, and
they're distracted with their own survival.
I think also, and they were, you know, what these guys in a basement in Paris were doing were competing with a media machine. With, you know, Goebbels ran a really slick international messaging system. You know, messaging as in brands, not as in like SMS or anything. So, you know, they were sweating in basements on typewriters, and they got books printed out of them. But essentially, those books were only as valuable as who they could get them to and read them. And again, the main problem with not left wing politics, but, you know, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier about social bubbles and echo chambers. Is that, you know, it's fine communicating this to people that already know. It's the people that don't know that you've got to try and get that message to. Yeah. And it's very challenging.
And so they've written these texts warning the world of this rising, I don't know what to call him, a supervillain. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
you know, this James, but far beyond James Bond villain.
Yeah. Well, they've gone into a stage now where they recognise that, you know, part of the reason they were sort of not turning their back on Moscow, but trying to shift their focus is there's a massive danger of what's happening in Germany. And having left Germany, they've got the early warning system. They know what Hitler's capable of because they've had to escape it.
Yeah.
You know, they've had to leave the country. And the only reason they've left the country is for fear of their lives.
Yeah.
We know that Hitler at this very early stage was already executing people that were not aligned politically. And that's people in his own party as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's a massive fear there, but there's also a fear that this isn't just now, to flip the story from earlier, this isn't just a German problem, this is an international problem.
Right.
And France will be the first that gets hit, as it always is. But this will hit, you know, America, England, as we know what follows.
As we know. And so where do they go from here?
So,
well, what year are we in now?
So he comes to Paris in 1933 and starts writing. The rest of the family follow later that year. In 1935, my gran comes to England as a refugee. So she's studying in French schools, but I think compulsory education stops at 15 in France, or it did then, certainly. And they were she was a very bright young woman. And I think they were quite fearful of the loss of her education. And also, I think there was definitely a sense that things are going to get worse before they get better. So through Willy Munzenberg, and actually this is quite interesting, I found correspondence from members of the British Labour Party with Willy Munzenberg about his, not necessarily about my grandmother, but I know that they were communicating, and those people that he was communicating with were responsible for my grandmother coming to England. So she was basically helped by the Labour Party through the Red Cross to come into England. And what's fascinating is she ended up becoming a Labour councillor for like 40 odd years sort of thing. So, I think there was like a debt owed or something like that. Or just like she was driven by her politics and her upbringing.
Right.
The rest of the family stayed in Paris. And then in 1936, the Spanish Civil War started. So do you know much about the Spanish Civil War?
I may know. No, not off the top of my head. I can't recall. But if you mention things may come to me. Because I've seen quite a few of these, like World War II in colour, and these really lengthy documentaries. I've binged them, but there is like today, like this subject, there's so much information to take on board, so many
moving parts
that it's almost impossible to understand in one concise thought, isn't it? So I may know a bit more than I think I do, but carry on.
I still struggle because it's so much is going on, and there's so much. If you think Germany has a lot of infighting in politics, Spain takes it up a notch.
Right.
It's, and we can definitely in this context, and particularly knowing now what happened afterwards, we can see what happens in Spain as a canapé for World War II.
Right.
It's where the left and the right extremes, and by that I mean Moscow against Germany and Italy, flex their muscles on a third party playground.
Is this Mussolini, or we predate?
No, this is Mussolini.
Right.
Mussolini seizes power like Hitler in 1933. I think it might have been a year earlier. Hitler was definitely inspired by Mussolini,
right?
And it wasn't. Mussolini didn't really seize power. He just sort of kind of took an opportunity, but then made that opportunity his own. But yeah, we definitely see in Spain that Moscow versus Italy and Germany. And then there's almost like a sort of a little subplot where the Spanish people are fighting and various international people get involved. But it's also becomes, as well as a testing point, it becomes a testing point for international involvement. So it's kind of Hitler testing his muscles for what he can get away with before other people get involved.
Right, I see.
So he knows that this is an opportunity to test new military tactics and new military weapons that he's been building on the sly in Germany. So we start to see the Luftwaffe and German tanks arriving in Spain.
The Luftwaffe is the Air Force, right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So it's the German Air Force, which theoretically they shouldn't have had, and they arrive in Spain, dropping bombs and practicing blitz warfare,
right?
Which they hadn't really done up until that point. But it's also, Hitler is really playing a charm game. He's trying to see what he can get away with before England and Britain, but basically England.
Yeah.
England, America, France, what they do. How much can he get away with before they start twitching?
Right.
And the result is he can go all the way.
Right.
Churchill didn't want to get involved. He didn't particularly like the Spanish people anyway.
Right.
He's quite vocal about that in his letters, bordering racist. He's not interested. He sees more problems at home. And actually, his fundamental argument is that he's more terrified of the Russians getting a foothold in Europe than he is about the fascists getting Spain.
Right.
The French do kind of what they do for the rest of that period, which is just sort of try not to get involved in anything, see how it pans out. They're sort of casually just sitting back, smokers of Chateau, waiting to see what unfolds. And America's got its own problems. It's the Great Depression, so they're really not wanting to get involved in an international war.
And they're quite far away.
They are quite far away. It hasn't stopped them before, and it won't stop. It hasn't stopped them since.
But it's not. It's not on their doorstep.
No, and I think also you got. I mean, who would they have had then? I can't remember. I can't even remember if it's a left or a right-wing government. They certainly had a lot of economic problems at home, but I think they were definitely trying not to get involved. I mean, so Albert in Paris, 1936. What happens in Spain is the monarchy's deposed. Essentially, there's a republic's formed by a government. The monarchy's deposed, and the military, led by, I can't remember his name. There's one guy that led the military, supported by Franco.
Right.
Don't like it. They're the military. They're royalists. They really want to basically overthrow the revolution, have a counter-revolution.
Right.
So they do. They try and do that. And then Albert, along with the several other communists, think this is a massive problem.
Right.
So they basically go to set up a battalion in Spain of German, not refugees, emigres, like people that have had to leave Germany by force to essentially help stand up against the counter-revolution in Spain. And this becomes the start of what is later known as the International Brigade. So people from socialist movements around the world come into Spain to support the original revolution, the revolution against the monarchy.
Right.
And it gets really confusing. It's so... as well as just the different factions, there's the factions within factions. So, for example, eventually what happens is you get this formalization of the International Brigades, of which Albert becomes one of the founding leaders of.
Dude's an overachiever, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a bastard. He becomes along with this guy called Hans Beimler, who's fascinating. He escaped a Nazi concentration camp by strangling a guard with a shoelace or something, and then taking his uniform. So he becomes a bit of a hero anyway.
Dude.
So these two guys basically set up this first German battalion in Spain in August 1936.
I just thinking now I wouldn't be able to do that because no one's outfit's going to fit me.
Yeah.
I have to wait for the...
And also, you'll be the first to go. Like,
you think?
Easy target. Just go for the big man.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. They'd either see me as a threat and bump me off straight away, or I'm good for the work.
Yeah,
but yeah, we digress. Yeah.
So basically then what unfolds is 3 years of fighting in Spain.
Right.
The international brigades become more pronounced, so by which you end up getting actually country-based battalions. Because one of the problems in the early days was that you had all these people coming from abroad, from different countries to help support the effort, the war effort.
So these like mercenaries, or are they more...
They're workers. They're basically they're trade unionists and workers and socialists from these different countries that read about this and kind of either recognise the threat or just feel like... I read something recently which is about, because there's been a few books in English about the Spanish Civil War lately, talking about this sort of sense of not having fought for what they believe in, because we had the First World War, obviously, until 1918, and certainly in England, and also by extension Scotland and Wales, and then also Ireland, you had quite strong left-wing movements that had sort of been disenfranchised by the First World War, and particularly in Ireland, sort of hung out to dry, and really up for a fight, but realising they didn't really have the resources or support to have that fight domestically. So when an opportunity came to fight internationally, fight for the same cause but in another country,
right?
That's something they want to do, which is exactly like the analogy you had earlier about people going to Afghanistan and Syria.
Right.
It's a very similar thing. There's a cause. People have felt a cause internationally for a belief system. They're going abroad illegally, most of them, and then fighting for that cause. The big problem they had in the early days of the the Spanish Civil War is that they would just bung everyone into one battalion. So you would have like Russian, Hungarian, Polish, Spanish, French, English, American, and obviously no one could communicate.
Yeah, I was going to say that doesn't bode well for tactics and organisation.
No, and you ended up with lots of struggles, and also certain characteristics emerged about the different kinds of people, like the different countries they came from. In the later years, you actually got a lot more formalised. So you would have named battalions or brigades, and they were named after socialist heroes from home. So you had like the most famous was the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was mostly African Americans coming over to fight. You had...
And that's Abraham Lincoln because he emancipated the...
Yeah, he's seen as a figurehead of like the left-wing movement in America.
Right.
And so, yeah, you had this, but then also there was lots of infighting. So you had, again, this sort of people going, oh, no, I'm the left-wing party. No, I'm the left-wing party. No, I'm the left-wing party. Yeah. So you had like things like, so George Orwell famously went to fight in Spain. He wrote a fantastic book called Homage to Catalonia.
I've heard Christopher Hitchens talk about this, actually. He was a staunch Orwellian, I guess you would say.
Yeah. Orwell's a really interesting character, and it really, I mean, this is where he was a socialist to his core, but he was very anti-communist, and most of that was from his experiences in Spain.
Right. Did he do some time in India? Is it Cal?
Yeah, well, he grew up there, I think.
Right.
Well, but did he grow up there? No, I think he was in the army there. But you're right, yeah. He came from sort of well-to-do stock.
Right.
I mean, I could go off on a tangent with what little I know about Orwell, but he's fascinating. You know, he went to masquerade as a tramp in Paris for 6 months just to see how the other half, you know, like what it's like to live on the streets. And that was fine, but then he wrote about it, and people were like, "Why would I want to read about this?" And actually, it's iconic. It's like it's observational journalism, which didn't really exist then to that extent. But anyway,
that's amazing. Yeah, that's another conversation.
He went over so he felt the calling, went over to Spain, and signed up with POUM, which was it was basically a Marxist but not communist sort of party. And the tragedy of Spain is that, as well as the ultimate victory of the fascists, mostly because they have superior weaponry and organisation and tactics, ultimately the left was just crippled by infighting.
Right.
Most of that was Russia. Like actually Russia deciding that it was going to be the one true left-wing party in Spain, to the point that it started executing other left-wing parties because they were...
so doing their enemy's job for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they're becoming extremely paranoid at this point.
Right.
And this is a period of time as well that Albert is there in a capacity that has strong relations with Russia. So this is where I get, like, not only... this is a period that I haven't researched a great deal because I'm sort of trying to consolidate the earlier story before moving on to this.
Yeah.
But it's an area where the politics become very grey, but I can also see it being very muddy on both sides. Like, there are accounts in the Russian archives of them describing Albert as, like, not a very good leader and not very good with the troops. And I'm thinking, yeah, but he's been at war for 20 years at this point. You know, like, I could see maybe this is the start of him getting disillusioned with things. Mm-hmm. That, you know, he's had to leave his home country.
And how old is he at that point?
So in 1936, he would be... my mental arithmetic's terrible. He was born in 1892. That's 8 plus 36. It's 44. Mid-40s, my age.
He's getting too old for that shit.
Well, definitely, I can empathise. So at this point, he's... You know, like, and although he's sort of in the front line and the military leader in the very early parts of the Spanish campaigns, he gets sent back to Albacete, which is like the sort of the Moscow's base in Spain.
Right.
So the focus of the left-wing movement in Spain is predominantly Barcelona, and he's definitely spending a lot of time in the early years in Barcelona.
Right.
But he gets sent almost to, like, the back line.
Yeah.
And I've never quite understood this, whether it's seen as, like, almost like a punishment, or whether it's actually
protecting.
Well, not protecting, but recognising, like, because what he ends up doing is becoming a historian, which is what he does for the rest of his life. So he ends up being charged with running a historical division. Which, like, why would you have a historical division in an armed conflict? But I don't know, and I don't know if that's a propaganda thing or if it's just like history is important type thing.
So what's the job of the historical division? To document it?
He's trying to write not only a history of the war,
right,
or an account of the war as it's happening, but also trying to understand what's historically happened in Spain forever. Like, you know, like, he's literally writing a history of Spain.
Okay. Is this because they believe they're going to win, and when they do, they're going to have to
genuinely
preserve its national identity?
I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know. And I really don't know. And it could be like...
Maybe he was a mole and they gave him this, like, fake cushy job.
Well, exactly. It sounds like it could be one of those cloak and dagger sort of fake organisations.
Right.
The historical division. Like, you know, like,
he's in there with the Morse code every day. Tap, 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 tap.
Almost like in... Ministry of Magic or something. Like, he's got to sneak in via toilets or something.
Yeah. So right. So he's given a desk job basically, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he's also training though. Like, the other thing is that I think Albuquerque is seen as this, and apologies to any Spanish listeners about my pronunciation again. So it becomes a training centre for people that are sent over to Spain or come over to Spain before they see action. So there's a military training element there, but then also it's an administrative centre. So he's partly involved in the military training of, like, officers and stuff, but because of his history. So I think at this point he's seen as a bit more of a teacher than a doer.
Right.
which happens to all of us.
Right. Well, he's got to this age where he's probably more valuable to them alive with the wisdom, his experience, his history with leading men. And let's be honest, at this point, we could probably assume that he is that natural leader that we were talking about earlier, because again, he's been put into another position.
I think he's a good practical leader.
Yeah.
I think the barriers to him in the Communist Party is he's not a charismatic leader.
Right.
Like, I think there's definitely instances where, like, and I can't believe I didn't show you this earlier. So one of the photos I got when I went to Berlin for the first time, they said, "Oh, here's some photos we found in the archive of your great grandfather."
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. So here's a nice picture of him, like in 1919, I think, and that's his wife, Emma. Nice moustache there and stuff like that. So we're looking at basically a group in 1919, 1920 of a bunch of socialists, it's almost like they've come round for Sunday, like
it looks like a dinner party, and they've kind of huddled for a picture.
There's a smile on his face, which I think is one of the few photos I've got of him with a smile on his face.
Right.
So it looks like they're having a bit of fun, and like they're obviously just chatting a lot, but having a few drinks or something like that.
Yeah.
But this was the other photo they showed me, and this is a photo from Stuttgart in 1918. So I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to explain in the context of what we were just talking about. So Albert's in that picture. I'm not asking you to look through every single... We're looking at a picture of a crowd.
Is Hitler in here?
No. This is Stuttgart in 1918.
Oh, right, because there's a famous picture that looks a lot like this, of lots of soldiers in a crowd, all gathering around at some sort of podium.
There's
one of Hitler in there.
That he might have been there, but I don't think he was.
Okay.
I think he probably would have steered clear of Stuttgart.
Sorry, I thought you were leading me down to that.
Anyway, so I was shown this picture, and I was like, great, it's a big crowd. Like, how on earth am I supposed to find my great-grandfather in there? And he said, he's the one giving the talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did I know that? I just looked at him straight away, I was like, that's him.
Yeah, so on a podium in front of thousands of soldiers, he's delivering a speech.
Right. Which goes against your idea of being a pragmatic leader and not a charismatic one.
But you've got to remember as well, that's the context of that is a military context. So that he's an officer speaking to his men.
It's expected of him.
Yeah.
Right.
But which is very different from a political leader.
Yeah.
And I think that throughout his career, he skirts around political leadership and becomes very familiar and friendly with political leaders. But he's never seen as a political leader. And I say that's important because for someone to assume leadership within a political party, they are chosen. They need to have a drive to do it, but ultimately they have to be chosen by their peers or someone else. And I think for him,
it's an appointed role, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think for him that never, like, I don't know whether he either never desired it or felt that he would be safer without it,
right?
Or that he just never was seen as the right candidate. And it may be that he never wanted to. He might have. If you think about the periods in his time that he became a leader, they were all around the military,
right?
They were all around like an assumed leadership role as an officer, as a military leader, as a figurehead of a particular movement, but never as a political leader. He was a political writer, but never.
I think your answer will lie within his writings.
Shame he wrote in German, eh?
Yeah, if he, I think that. So what I'm trying to say is, if he is self-mythologizing within his writing, you could probably assume and lean on the side of a charismatic.
Well, it's the difficulty
and if he's
there.
Not, then it's more probably.
So the difficulty
more
there is most of the writing that survives is from his time in East Germany,
right?
And all writing was monitored, censored, and observed,
right?
So he would never have been able to publish an honest account. Well, in his later years, which is it comes back to the very genesis of this conversation, which is that ultimately he asked my uncle to write his story because he knew he would never be able to, or had never been able to. And I think
that's way more powerful after 4 hours of discussion. Now hearing that moment, when he sits there and he goes, yeah, that's a crazy moment. Yeah. That was an important.
It was a bit
detail.
A bit of baggage to handle, yeah.
Yeah, but that's a great because when you first hear that, you kind of think, well,
old man, deathbed.
Yeah, and is it like is it an ego thing? But no, it's not. It's just that for his entire life, everything he's done has been someone else has tried to change the narrative, skewer it, tried to kill him. And then when he was finally kind of, I guess you would say, free in living out his years in, I guess what you'd call sort of peacetime, he couldn't fucking tell his story then properly.
No, everything was controlled either by Moscow or the state. So he became a historian, and then later a senior figure in the Historical Museum of Berlin.
Right.
Everything had to have a message, all the stories. And the bitterness for Albert was that, so for example, with the Hamburg uprising and then the Rotfront Kampfverband, is that it was what the communists and most left-wing organizations are very good at is idolatry. Find an individual, celebrate them, worship them, make them the figurehead. And
iconoclastic.
Exactly. And this is, without going off on too much of a tangent, I can see this is where the problem with Corbyn lay, is that he became this sort of iconic figure. And irrespective of his faults or otherwise, it's very impossible to live up to those expectations. And one of Albert's frustrations with running history department and lecturing, teaching, and very much teaching the history that he was a part of, he was a modern historian technically, was that he wasn't in the history books. And I don't think that's an egotistical thing. I think that was a sort of a truth thing. Like someone in Bristol actually has written a PhD on the Germans' involvement in the Spanish Civil War, but also the folk memory of that in later Germany, particularly East Germany.
Wow.
And she mentions Albert quite a few times in her PhD. And one of the things that sticks in my mind is a footnote talking about he was constantly writing to sort of seek some kind of recognition because he was never recognized for his role in the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
But the people he went there, like with Hans Beimler, for example, were celebrated. And he was like, yeah, but I didn't get shot, so somehow I'm not important.
Right.
Because he wasn't a martyr, he wasn't celebrated. And
you might also be able to take the idea that, if you've got a history book that doesn't have you in it, and how important you were to it, that's a real issue for truth, isn't it?
Yeah,
if you remove your own ego, if you're not in there, and you were there. How can you expect anyone to believe that and take that seriously?
Yeah, and I'd like to think, as a historian, I think part of his disgruntlement was just that it wasn't the truth being told.
Yeah,
I do think, but also, I'd be fucking miffed.
Yeah.
If I'd become...
I'd be fucking miffed if I went to prison and no one talked about it.
Well, and everyone's talking about my mate that got shot,
Right.
It's like, oh, God.
But you also got shot in the face.
Yeah.
Did all this. Yeah, I mean, I totally get it, I mean, he's a dude's what an incredible story. And we're not at the end of this yet. We're in hour 4. So I don't even really feel the need to spur this on, because I almost want this to be the audio document of this. Do you know what I mean?
We're almost at the end of my detailed understanding of what happens.
Right.
So, and that's partly I'm less interested about what happens after 1941. Partly because someone's written a book about him after that period in German, and that's more about his role in the socio-political history of East Germany, mostly as an academic, but also his role he had quite an important role in exile. So he was one of a number of Germans in America, particularly New York, that has sought exile and were trying to determine what should happen to Germany once Hitler was defeated. And they were, having learnt their experience with the First World War, they were very, proactive about, this shouldn't be about blaming the German people. This is an individual's crimes. You shouldn't be blaming the nation for what he has done.
Right.
Yeah, people got sucked along with it, which is a gross oversimplification of what happened. But the thrust of it was that after First World War, the whole of Germany was punished for the actions of a few.
Right.
And that ended up causing the mess we got into with World War II. So he was part of a vocal group that, irrespective of their current ideological beliefs, i.e. communist, were very keen to ensure that the same problems didn't happen again. But after that point, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book in America in English, Lessons of Germany, which was written in, I can't remember what year. It was while World War II was still happening.
Right.
Talking about how the lessons of history, what we can learn about the history of Germany, but also how we should treat it going forwards and involve the German people in that conversation. So very forward thinking. And he was surrounded by very famous German intellectuals, like the most famous of which probably Bertolt Brecht, who's a famous playwright that was in exile. What I've missed out on is what happens between Spain. Because all I'm saying is that after this period of time, although it's interesting, it's less interesting to me because it's less so about the family story, because at this point they get separated.
Right.
And because of the Iron Curtain, actually, they see very little of each other for the rest of their lives.
Right.
Tragically. But I think also it becomes much more, it becomes less about my personal history or personal interest in European history. He's at the forefront of for a period of time.
Yeah.
East German history I'm less interested in, that post-war Cold War era. And also because he plays much less of a part of it. He sort of essentially goes into retirement as soon as he goes back to Germany. He teaches, but that's essentially retirement for him.
I do love the way this is ended in a way, because
I've missed out on a bit. May I
go for it?
So what we haven't discussed is what happens after Spain. So the bottom line is the Franco and the warrior, the nationalist, rather than nationalist sort of forces, with the help of Mussolini and Hitler, win.
Right.
1938, I think. So Albert has to go back to France, where he is promptly arrested.
Right.
And sent to a concentration camp. It's not the concentration camps we understand at this stage. It's very much like just an imprisonment camp. And there are certain degrees of freedom afforded to them. But essentially, it's called a concentration camp because he, again, like I've said before, he is being imprisoned for his beliefs. There is no crime being committed except for a crime of believing in something other than what the state want. And this is, by this point, there is sort of concessions being made in France towards the Germans. So he's imprisoned. And ultimately, the next 2 years are him being moved around concentration camps around France.
Right.
And also his wife and second daughter are also imprisoned.
Right.
So they are moving around, but in different camps. So they're trying to write to each other and contact with each other for a year and a half, 2 years, without seeing each other. And then they eventually find each other. She in Marseille. Albert's in a camp called Camp Les Milles, which is tragically becomes one of the sort of gateway camps to then send people off to like Dachau and Auschwitz later in not just Jews but political prisoners as well, particularly enemies of the state and such. And they somehow managed to secure a visa to get out. Now, because of Albert's writing, he has connections internationally, and then someone from New York basically writes in a letter of recommendation to allow him to leave France, because you were allowed to leave a concentration camp, but only if you had guaranteed onward travel.
Right.
And at this moment, they're stateless. The Germans had annulled their nationality, so they are stateless. So they are international refugees. So, but through the League of Writers, or basically a left-wing writers guild in America, they managed to secure onward travel to Mexico.
Right.
So they secure these visas. They get travel on the SS Wyoming out of Marseille, which stops at Casablanca, and Albert's arrested again in Casablanca. And then spends 3 months in different camps. The whole time, Emma and Helga are trying to speak to various embassies to try and get him out of prison or camps in Africa. And eventually they get, this is like the film, they get one of the last boats they get him a visa onto Mexico, one of the last boats out of Casablanca to New York. Well, with an aim to get, so they've got visas to travel to Mexico, but they has to go via New York because of, it's a long way to Mexico.
Right.
So they go over on the SS Serpa Pinto, a Portuguese liner. Used to be a Royal Mail frigate, bizarrely. So done my digging. So and then they get to Ellis Island, and because they're sort of stateless, they have to go into sort of not quarantine, but like a refugee camp, basically.
Right.
They're basically sort of temporarily.
They have to go somewhere where the authorities know they're not going elsewhere.
Yeah, they basically just need to do checks, but
keep an eye on you.
A few months, but unfortunately, by this time, America started to get involved because this is like 1941, so the World War II's been kicking off now. America's always said it won't get involved, but it concedes to get involved in the Atlantic conflict. So basically, the battle between British and German fleets in control of the Atlantic Channel.
Right.
Because it's not just about military, it's about the control of movement. Like, so for example, Britain was having lots of resources shipped back from the Caribbean and likewise Spain and Portugal and Southern America and stuff. So America got involved, and with that decision, onward travel from America to Mexico was stopped. So their visa had expired, or it was annulled. So they had to they became illegal refugee, not illegal. Well, they were allowed into, but they weren't allowed out of New York. So they basically set up shop in New York.
Is that what an illegal alien is?
Well, I suppose an illegal alien is someone that doesn't have a right to remain.
Right.
And I think but war, obviously this is a war, so it's a very, I think definitely they didn't have the right to remain, but they weren't allowed to leave the country to go elsewhere. So they were kind of a bit stuck. So they ended up in the Bronx in New York, and he got a job as a watchmaker.
Right.
For some years.
And your phone is going off.
I'll just suppress that.
Yeah, we've really been going. So he's as a watchmaker.
So he becomes a watchmaker in New York, the Bronx, for, how long were they there for? 5 years. In the interim, their second daughter, Helga, meets a guy over there, Polish guy, and then ends up marrying. So when they secure safe passage back to, once the war's over, they secure safe passage back to Germany. That's Albert and Emma. Helga decides to stay. So she meets this guy, stays, moves to Detroit, grows a family, raises a family in Detroit.
Yeah.
So, and I always think this is quite tragic because of, then he's stuck behind the Iron Curtain when he goes back to Germany, being part of the communist state. So he ends up in East Germany, initially in Leipzig and then in Berlin. And both his daughters are the other side of the wall. So, like going back to what we were saying earlier, everything he fought for was for them. And then actually when he didn't get it, but when he survived the conflict and the turmoil, there was a big literal and metaphorical barrier between them. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to transfer between those two.
Right.
And so they would have seen each other, but not nearly as regularly as I'm sure they would have liked.
And that is where he lives out the rest of his days as a historian not in the right state. No.
He was a professor at Leipzig and then became like a curator or director of the Historisches Museum in Berlin.
Berlin, right. Where what year is that? Where do we end up now? We end up.
Well, I don't. Like I said, I'm not so familiar with his history once he ends up back in Germany. I mean, there's some stuff in the archives, and I haven't really talked about the archives, and I don't want to go off on a tangent now because it's 11:15. When I first went to the archives, I said I want to see the Albert Schreiner files,
right?
And they said which ones.
And you went, yippee!
All of them. And they said it's not possible. There's 155 files.
Right.
So they had so much information. So partly my interest is born of what I was able to access in the finite time I was there looking at the archives.
So do you need to go back again and read the rest?
I definitely could do with going back, but I've also got to put limits on what I'm doing. And this is why I've drawn a line under 1941, because it's interesting, but it becomes less of a family story and less of a story that has a relevance to a broader political struggle. And then it becomes more of his career trajectory. Yeah. And although that's interesting, I'm personally less interested in that.
Right.
I think.
That's fascinating to me because you've done so much. It almost feels like you've just got to that very last bit and you've gone, I've got what I need now.
Well, I think I also just got to put a cap on it, It's like so with the comic, my original idea was in 6 months, I'll have a comic book about his life.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, I'm still scratching the iceberg.
Yeah.
Scratching the iceberg. You know what I mean?
The tip of the iceberg. Yeah. So you need to say, look, for this project and for the people who have invested via Kickstarter, to see a result from this, you need to do a little bit of
I need to put limits on it, and I need to break it up into smaller chunks. So with the Kickstarter, I will be at some point in the near or not near future. I will be delivering a book.
Well, you wait till this comes out, and all of a sudden there's a worldwide...
Some mysterious rich benefactor.
Yeah, there's a worldwide interest in this character, Albert, and,
I mean, and like you said, so writing it, because obviously I'm writing for comic, which is a different medium to just historical writing.
Yeah.
It's a very cinematic form of writing.
Yes. Well, it's storyboards.
So you're having to visualize it. And so I'm thinking about it being a film, but then also recognizing that obviously I can't. There's finite amounts I can capture in static images.
Yeah.
So there's lots to do here, and I do think I do think it's a story that has relevance and interest to more than just the family.
Yeah.
But it's a story that I know I've recognised I need to invest time in trying to pick apart.
Yeah.
Because there's no point rushing it, because there's too much to learn, and I'm still sort of on the, there's still so much more I can find out.
Yeah.
Particularly his time in Spain and Paris. I've only really got little bits here and there on those.
And what is so amazing is that, he does get to it. He's, after all of this, all the metaphorical bullets he's dodged, all the literal bullets he's dodged, he lives out the rest. He basically rides off into the sunset a little bit.
Yeah.
He wins. He doesn't get slain. He doesn't become a villain. There's that be a hero, live long enough to say, what's that? You could be a villain. No, shit. What is it? Be a hero, but live long enough to see yourself become the villain, right? Yeah. None of that shit happens to him.
But I think his ideals change as well. By the time it gets to the end of the Second World War, or even halfway through the Second World War, his goal is survival. Or up until the mid-20s, maybe even 1933, his goal is changing the world.
Yeah.
And then it just changes. It suddenly becomes about survival. And then there's a slight distraction with Spain where he sees an opportunity to try and, go back to the glory days, but it doesn't quite work. But then it all becomes about survival. So, I think you're right. There's a degree of once he sort of gets back into Germany, he's not at peace, because I think he's still very dissatisfied with some of the outcomes. But he recognises now that his time for fighting has passed.
Yeah. And he couldn't have done a better crack at it.
Well, he certainly gave a crack at it.
Yeah. I mean, at some point he has to go, well, I did my best. Did my best. And I just love the imagery of your uncle being there at the end of this.
Yeah.
As he doesn't go out on his own terms, but he's not taken out. Do you know what I mean? He lives out the rest of his biological life. And then there's something really magical about the fact that you've just popped in on your uncle at this point in time, and he's given you the mission. Do you know what I mean? And I think, although you haven't got your book finished yet, we've been here since 6:30 this evening. It's now essentially 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
You've done 5 hours. You've just told his entire life story that you know of.
Yeah.
To a degree, you've done it. I know this is just a modest podcast, but if nothing else, if that book never happens, this has happened.
Yeah,
you've done this.
A record of what's going on in my.
There's a record here, and I feel weird. I feel privileged actually to have got to sit here for this long. I was not expecting this much detail, this much history, And I feel like emotionally connected to this character now. And it's just such an epic story. It's so epic.
Oh God, it's not just me that thinks that.
No, it's so epic. It's unbelievable. And I'm just trying to digest it all. And it's a novel in itself. This man could have been a character in a series of very famous literature, I think. He's absolutely incredible. And the way that you have, yes, you've got some books and some materials here, some photographs, etc. But you have literally just reeled it off for 4 hours, just off the top of your head. And we've been drinking. Do you know what I mean? It's just been great. I knew it was going to be good, but I just thank you so much. I feel really lucky, actually, privileged to have this much of your time and just take all this in.
It's making me realise how much stuff's just been sitting in my head. Without the outlet, because although I've been working on it, there isn't an end product yet. So it's just kind of sitting there, festering. Not festering, cogitating, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is almost like you've just backed it all up.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more in there in your head, but you've backed it up, basically.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of, because it's also demonstrated how much research has been involved in it.
Yeah.
And that's not even getting on to the execution, just the writing, the drawing,
So what I want to do is, I don't know how this will be presented in its final form. God bless Harry for having to edit this, but this is even going to be
some homebrew.
Yeah, I don't think he drinks though, actually. But this will either be a 2 or 3-parter, I think. And when you finally got it done and dusted, let's come back on. Maybe not for 4 hours. Let's come back on and let's catch up.
Yeah.
Tell me how it went, and we'll talk about the art and how you visualized things.
Cool.
And, but it's bloody great. That was great. I don't know. I feel like we've finished now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you good to finish?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of where
my phone's been going as well.
Yeah. Your wife thinks you've been abducted or something. Yeah. I just wondered where our fade out point will be, but that's. Thank you so much for listening to this big bumper jumbo edition of the Giant Pod. Thank you to Cole, our guest, for being so articulate and so well researched and really, really bringing Albert's life to life for us over that very long podcast. What an epic. I will never forget this. It was such a good story. And at the end of it, I kind of felt a bit emotional for the characters, a bit like when you're watching a film or a TV show and you're so invested in what's happening in the story that when it ends you feel a bit, that's the end of it. It was a strange feeling, but a good one nonetheless. If you want to keep up with what's happening with the project Finding Albert, we will leave the relative links in the show notes description. Please like, subscribe, and review this podcast. Please tell one friend who you think would like this. That would really help us out. Please follow us on Instagram and Twitter. It is @TheGiantPod. You can follow my personal Instagram at Andy_S1S. This podcast was produced by the heroic Harry Williams. We will see you soon in season 2 of The Giant Pod. Take care of yourselves. Thanks very much.